To understand what happened in June of 1941, you have to understand what the Soviet Union was in June of 1941. Joseph Stalin had been in power since 1924, first as General Secretary of the Communist Party and then, through a systematic process of eliminating rivals, co-opting allies, and murdering anyone who might conceivably threaten his position, as the absolute and unchallenged dictator of 1/6 of the Earth's surface. By 1941 he had been the most powerful man in the Soviet Union for nearly 2 decades, and in those 2 decades he had done 2 things simultaneously that defined what his country would become. He had industrialized it at a pace that had no precedent in history, and he had traumatized it in ways that also had no precedent in history. The industrialization was real and massive. In 1913, Russia produced roughly 4 million tons of steel per year. By 1940, the Soviet Union produced 18 million tons. Coal production tripled. Electrical output multiplied 7 times. Factories appeared in places that had been empty steppe 20 years before. Cities grew from nothing. The great Soviet experiment in forced industrialization was brutal and wasteful and killed millions of people through the collectivization of agriculture and the engineered famines that followed. But by 1941 the Soviet Union was, in terms of sheer industrial capacity, a major power. And then Stalin tried to destroy it. Not the factories, those he needed. He destroyed the people who ran them, the people who led the armies that protected them, the people who might someday challenge him. The Great Terror of 1936 to 1938 consumed perhaps 750,000 people who were shot and perhaps 1.3 million more who were sent to the labor camps of the Gulag. It consumed party officials and factory managers and engineers and scientists. And it consumed, with particular thoroughness, the officer corps of the Red Army. Mikhail Nikolaevich Tukhachevsky was the most brilliant military mind the Soviet Union had produced. The son of a minor nobleman from Penza, he had served as an officer in the Tsar's Imperial Guards before the Revolution, joined the Bolsheviks in 1918, and over the following 2 decades had become the theoretical and organizational center of the Red Army's intellectual life. He was the man who suppressed the Kronstadt Rebellion in 1921 and who directed the crushing of the Tambov peasant uprising, using, in the latter case, artillery and chemical weapons against his own countrymen, a fact that underlines the moral complexity of the man. He was also the man who read Liddell Hart and Fuller and the French tank theorists and synthesized their ideas with Russian military traditions to produce something genuinely new. Tukhachevsky's great contribution, codified in the Provisional Field Regulations of 1936, known as PU-36, was the concept of deep battle operations. The idea was elegant and, in retrospect, exactly right. Modern warfare should not be about grinding through an enemy's front line and then fighting through his reserves one layer at a time. That was the bloody logic of the First World War trenches. Instead, a modern army equipped with tanks and aircraft and motorized infantry should attack simultaneously across the entire depth of the enemy's defensive system, hitting the front line at the same moment that paratroopers disrupted the rear, that mechanized forces exploited gaps to race toward supply depots and headquarters, that aviation destroyed the artillery that would otherwise stop the advance. An enemy struck at every point simultaneously cannot reinforce any point. He either collapses or retreats, and either way the attacking force wins ground and time. This was the theory that would later, in different forms and with varying attributions, become the doctrine of blitzkrieg in German hands and deep battle in Soviet ones. Tukhachevsky had it first clearly articulated in 1936. In June 1937, he was arrested on charges of being a German spy. The charges were almost certainly fabricated, possibly with assistance from German intelligence, which had obvious interest in removing the Red Army's most capable theorist before the inevitable confrontation. What is certain is that the evidence was forged, that Tukhachevsky was tortured until his fingerprints, bloody fingerprints, staining the confession document in a way that Soviet archivists noted with clinical precision when the files were opened after the fall of the Soviet Union, appeared on a confession he had not written. He was tried in a secret proceeding that lasted approximately 1 hour. He was shot on June 12, 1937. He was 44 years old. What followed was not a purge in the ordinary sense of the word. It was the decapitation of an entire military institution. Consider the specific names. Iona Yaker, commander of the Kyiv military district, was one of the most respected operational commanders in the Soviet military, a man who had fought in the Civil War with distinction and who had spent the interwar years building one of the Red Army's most capable regional forces. He was arrested in June 1937 and shot in August. Yerenym Ubarevich, commander of the Belarusian military district, a man who had personally supervised large-scale maneuver exercises that the foreign military attaches who attended described as genuinely impressive, arrested and shot the same month. Alexander Yegorov, chief of the General Staff and one of the 5 marshals of the Soviet Union, architect of the Red Army's organizational structure through the 1930s, arrested in 1938, tortured, and shot in 1939. These were not obscure figures at the margins of the Soviet military. They were its backbone. By the time the terror ran its course, the Red Army had lost 3 of its 5 marshals, 13 of 15 army commanders, 50 of 57 corps commanders, 154 of 186 division commanders, and roughly 35,000 officers at various levels, executed or imprisoned. 35,000 officers, representing the institutional memory and professional expertise of an army that had taken 20 years to build. The mechanics of the terror were as destructive as its results. Officers who were arrested were pressured to name accomplices. Men they knew, men they had served with, men who had done nothing wrong and who would now be arrested and pressured to name others in turn. The cascade was almost self-sustaining. Officers who refused to name names were themselves accused of protecting traitors, which was itself a crime. The rational response, and most people under extreme duress respond rationally in the sense of doing what they think will stop the pain, was to name names. To give the interrogators something. Entire networks of accusation spread through the officer corps, each arrest producing 2 or 3 more, until the system was saturated and began to consume men who had been among the accusers rather than the accused. The political officers assigned to every military unit, the commissars, added another layer of paralysis. They had the authority and the obligation to report on the political reliability of the commanders they shadowed. A commander who made a tactical decision that could be characterized as insufficiently aggressive, or that resulted in unnecessary casualties, or that the commissar simply misunderstood, could be reported to the NKVD. The logical response was to avoid initiative entirely. Initiative got you shot. Rigidly following orders, even idiotic orders, at least gave you someone else to blame. And there were warnings. In the spring of 1941, German preparations for Barbarossa were not secret to everyone. A German communist named Alfred Lisko, a worker who had been drafted into the Wehrmacht, crossed the Soviet lines near Sokol in Ukraine on the evening of June 21st and told the Soviet border guards that the German attack would begin at 3 a.m. His information was transmitted to Moscow. A Soviet intelligence officer named Richard Sorg, operating in Tokyo with access to German diplomatic communications, had been reporting for months that Germany intended to attack. 84 separate intelligence warnings about the German buildup reached Moscow between March and June 1941, according to later Soviet analysis. Stalin dismissed them all, or explained them away as British provocations designed to drag the Soviet Union into the war. He had convinced himself that Germany would not attack in 1941, and no amount of contrary evidence could penetrate that conviction. General Dmitry Grigorievich Pavlov commanded the Western Military District, the Soviet forces in Belarusia, directly in the path of the German Army Group Center's axis of advance. He was not a stupid man. He had commanded Soviet tank forces in the Spanish Civil War, had acquired experience of modern mechanized combat that most of his colleagues lacked. But his lessons from Spain were partly the wrong ones. He had concluded, incorrectly, that tanks were too vulnerable to be used in concentrated armored formations, and he dispersed his armor in a way that made it nearly useless for either attack or defense. When the German attack came, his communications failed almost immediately. The Luftwaffe specifically targeted radio stations and telephone exchanges in the first hours. His units, cut off from any coordination, fought or fled or simply ceased to exist as organized formations. When Moscow could not reach Pavlov for updates on the catastrophe unfolding on his front, Stalin's response was to have him arrested. On July 22, 1941, exactly 1 month after the invasion began, Pavlov and his chief of staff were shot for cowardice and dereliction of duty. The actual failure was not cowardice. It was the accumulated weight of 2 years of purges and 1 catastrophic morning. This was the army that awaited the Germans in June 1941. And yet it is important not to overstate the dysfunction, because that would misrepresent what the Red Army actually was. Even at its worst, in June 1941, it contained a corps of capable officers who had survived the purges and who would, given time and opportunity, demonstrate that survival had not been random. It contained millions of soldiers who, whatever their feelings about the Soviet system, were motivated to fight. It contained, at the level of the individual unit, genuine competence and genuine courage that persisted even as the institutional structures above failed catastrophically. Private Ivan Dobryakov was a 20-year-old soldier from Ryazan Oblast who was in a rifle company near Brest when the barrage opened on June 22. His memoir, written decades after the war and preserved in a regional museum archive, describes the first morning with a clarity that suggests the trauma imprinted it permanently. "The sound was the end of the world," he wrote. "I had no other reference for it. I was in my barracks when it began and I ran out and the sky was fire and the ground was shaking and men around me were screaming or running or standing still with their mouths open. My sergeant grabbed me by the collar and told me to pick up my rifle. I picked it up. We ran toward the sound. This was, I think, the most irrational decision of my life. But the sergeant was running toward the sound and I ran after him. Later I understood why. Running toward the guns was better than staying where the shells were landing. Also, the sergeant told me to." Dobryakov fought through the entire war. He was wounded 4 times. He went home in 1945 to a village that had been burned and rebuilt. He worked as a collective farm laborer for 30 years. He wrote his memoir in 1978 and it was never published in his lifetime. The morning of June 22, 1941 began at 3:15 a.m. That was the moment the German artillery opened fire along a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Romanian border. The barrage that followed was the largest artillery opening in the history of warfare to that point, over 7,200 guns firing simultaneously along 1,800 miles of front. It was not simply the opening of a battle. It was the beginning of what the Germans had planned as the decisive campaign of the entire war, the operation that would end the Soviet state and deliver to the Third Reich the Lebensraum, living space, that Hitler had been promising since Mein Kampf. Operation Barbarossa committed 3.8 million soldiers, organized into 3 army groups. North, driving toward Leningrad. Center, driving toward Moscow. And South, driving toward Ukraine and the oil fields beyond. It deployed approximately 3,300 tanks, 7,200 artillery pieces, and 2,770 aircraft. Against it, the Soviet Union had theoretically larger numbers in almost every category. But the Germans had something more valuable than numerical superiority. They knew how to use what they had, and they knew how to use it together. The German army that crossed into the Soviet Union in June 1941 was the most experienced combat force in the world. It had fought in Poland in 1939, in France and the Low Countries in 1940, in the Balkans in 1941. Its commanders had learned the lessons of modern mechanized warfare from actual campaigns, and they had learned them well. The blitzkrieg, the coordinated use of armor, motorized infantry, artillery, and close air support to penetrate enemy lines and encircle large formations before they could react, had destroyed the Polish army in 3 weeks and the French army in 6. There was no reason, from the German perspective, to think it would take longer than 8 weeks to destroy the Soviets. The Luftwaffe moved first, attacking Soviet airfields in the pre-dawn darkness before a single German soldier had crossed the border. Soviet aircraft were parked neatly on their fields, lined up in rows close together, ideal targets. At Brest, at Grodno, at Kobrin and Pinsk and dozens of other airfields across the western military districts, Soviet pilots ran toward their planes in the first light of dawn and found them already burning. Some managed to get airborne. Most did not. German pilots flew 4, 5, sometimes 6 sorties on June 22, returning to report destruction on a scale that seemed almost unreal. By the end of the first day, the Soviet Air Force had lost approximately 1,200 aircraft, the majority of them on the ground, never having fired a weapon. On the ground, the border guards received the first shock. The Brest Fortress, a massive 19th century fortification at the confluence of the Bug and Mukovets rivers, directly on the border, held perhaps 7,000 Soviet soldiers on the morning of June 22, most of them from rear echelon support units. The Germans expected to take it in hours. They did not take it in hours. A garrison of perhaps 3,500 men, cut off without resupply, with no hope of relief, held the Brest Fortress against sustained German assault for weeks. The last organized resistance ended around late July. Major Pyotr Gavrilov, one of the final defenders, was captured only on July 23, a month after the invasion had begun, skeletal, wounded, alone. He had been living on water from the fortress's cisterns and whatever food he could find in the rubble. The Germans who captured him treated him with notable respect. He survived German captivity and was rehabilitated after the war, living until 1979, a man who had held a fortress for a month against the Wehrmacht in the summer that most people believed the Soviet Union would collapse in 8 weeks. But the Brest fortress was an anomaly. Elsewhere, the German advance moved at speeds that overwhelmed every attempt at coherent defense. The border armies had been positioned forward, close to the frontier, on Stalin's orders. When the German tanks broke through the border defenses and began driving east, they found the road to the interior essentially open. The encirclements began almost immediately. General Franz Halder, chief of the German General Staff, wrote in his diary on July 3, 1941, 11 days into the campaign, that it is thus probably no overstatement to say that the Russian campaign has been won in the space of 2 weeks. He was not alone in this belief. The British Joint Intelligence Committee assessed that organized Soviet resistance would collapse by autumn. At the German Foreign Ministry, officials had begun drafting the administrative framework for governing the territory that would soon be under German control. They were all wrong. But in the summer of 1941, no one knew that yet. The encirclements of summer 1941 are worth dwelling on, because their scale is genuinely difficult to absorb. At Minsk, in the first 10 days of the campaign, German armored forces encircled 12 Soviet divisions and captured approximately 290,000 men, the equivalent of the entire British expeditionary force that had been evacuated from Dunkirk the previous year, captured in less than a fortnight. At Uman in July and August, another 103,000 were taken. At Smolensk in July, the battle lasted longer and cost the Germans more, but the result was again encirclement and the capture of over 300,000 Soviet soldiers. And then Kyiv, the catastrophe that ended General Karponos. General Mikhail Karponos commanded the southwestern front, the Soviet forces in Ukraine. In late August 1941, he could see clearly what was developing. German armored forces from Army Group Center were swinging south while German armored forces from Army Group South were swinging north, and the junction point would close somewhere behind his armies. He sent message after message to Moscow requesting permission to retreat before the trap closed. Stalin refused. Retreat was not permitted. In Stalin's framework of thinking, commanders who requested permission to retreat were either cowards or defeatists, and permitting retreat was itself an act of weakness that the Soviet state could not display. On September 19, 1941, the German pincers closed at the town of Lukvitsa, east of Kyiv. The encirclement was complete. Karponos himself died attempting to break out of the trap on September 20th, killed by a shell fragment in a ravine southeast of Kyiv. His armies, roughly 665,000 men, in what remains the largest military encirclement in history, were captured or killed in the weeks that followed. 665,000 men in one battle. When the Germans tallied the results of the Kyiv encirclement, they counted over 600,000 Soviet soldiers taken prisoner. The numbers seemed almost impossible, more men than were in entire armies. General Halder updated his diary. The campaign was won. The Soviet Union was finished. It was not finished. But by the time the autumn rains turned the Russian steppe to mud and the German advance stalled in the Rasputitsa, the Soviet Union had lost in killed, wounded, and captured approximately 2.8 million soldiers in just over 3 months of fighting. The Red Army of June 22, 1941, the army that had been positioned at the border, the army that had been painstakingly assembled through 2 decades of Soviet industrialization, was largely gone. What replaced it was something that had to be built while being simultaneously destroyed. By October 1941, the German Army Group Center was 45 miles from Moscow. Operation Typhoon, the German offensive against the Soviet capital, had begun on October 2nd with a devastating initial success. The Soviet forces in front of Moscow were encircled at Vyazma and Bryansk. Another catastrophic disaster that produced 663,000 more prisoners and tore open the front that had been painstakingly rebuilt over 3 months of fighting. The road to Moscow appeared, once again, to be open. German reconnaissance units could see the towers of the Kremlin through their field glasses. German military maps began to include Moscow's street grid. In Moscow itself, the panic was visible and audible. Government ministries began moving east, to Kuibyshev on the Volga, packed into trains that ran continuously through the short October days. Factory equipment was being dismantled and loaded onto flat cars. NKVD units were burning documents in the courtyard of the Lubyanka, the ash drifting through the Moscow streets. On October 16th, a date that Muscovites would later call the Big Skedaddle, the city went into collective breakdown. Party officials abandoned their posts. Shops were looted. Crowds fought to get onto trains at Kazan station. The roads east of Moscow were jammed with cars and carts and people on foot, carrying what they could. The smell of burning paper was everywhere. The private archives of institutions that had existed for decades, consumed in an afternoon. Stalin stayed. On November 7, 1941, the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, celebrated every year with a military parade through Red Square, Stalin held the parade. The German forces were 40 miles away. The Luftwaffe was overhead. The troops who marched through Red Square in the November cold went directly from the parade to the front. Stalin stood on the Lenin mausoleum in his military greatcoat and watched them go, and a newsreel crew filmed it, and the footage was broadcast throughout the Soviet Union and internationally. The message was not subtle: Moscow would not fall. The man who had ordered the evacuation of the government, who had genuinely considered, according to some accounts, though this remains debated, negotiating with Germany through Bulgarian intermediaries, was standing on Lenin's tomb watching soldiers march toward the guns. Whether it was courage or calculation or both, it worked. The parade became one of the most important symbolic events of the war. The man Stalin turned to for the military defense of Moscow was Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov. Zhukov was, by October 1941, already the most important military commander in the Soviet Union, which is another way of saying that he had survived the purges and managed to demonstrate enough competence to be useful to Stalin without demonstrating enough independence to be dangerous. He was 50 years old, the son of a cobbler from Kaluga, a man who had risen from private in the Tsar's cavalry in World War I to the position of Deputy Supreme Commander under Stalin. He was not a subtle man. He was not a warm man. He was, by every account of those who served under him, a man of absolute clarity about what a battle required and iron determination to provide it regardless of cost. The men he drove hardest were often men he trusted most, which did not make it easier to serve under him, but explains why his subordinates kept performing beyond what other commanders could extract from similar human material. He would appear at a command post unannounced, study the maps in silence for several minutes, ask 3 or 4 specific questions, and then issue orders with the precision of someone who had already made every decision before he arrived. Against him, the German forces facing Moscow were running out of everything: ammunition, food, fuel, winter clothing. The German army had been issued summer uniforms based on the 8-week planning timeline. Those 8 weeks were now 4 months, and the temperature in front of Moscow was dropping. By mid-November, it was -20 degrees Celsius. By late November, it was -30. By December, it was -40 in some sectors. What -40 degrees does to a man and a machine is specific and terrible. Machine gun oil thickens and freezes in the mechanism. Weapons that had been cleaned and maintained perfectly in the autumn simply did not fire in December. Diesel fuel viscosifies and will not flow through fuel lines designed for temperatures no lower than -15. Engines that are not kept running continuously cannot be started in the morning, and keeping engines running continuously consumes fuel that is already desperately short. Soldiers in summer uniforms wrapped themselves in whatever they could find: straw, newspapers, cloth torn from the interior walls of buildings they occupied. Fingers froze and turned black. Soldiers who fell asleep in their foxholes sometimes did not wake up. The Soviet forces received reinforcements from Siberia. Full-strength divisions of well-trained soldiers who had spent years in the Soviet Far East, fully acclimatized to extreme cold, wearing quilted padded suits and felt boots designed for exactly these temperatures, carrying weapons that had been winterized. They arrived by train through November and December, unloading at stations east of Moscow and moving directly into the line. When they appeared at the front, fresh, equipped, moving easily in conditions that had reduced German soldiers to huddled, shivering figures trying to survive the night, the psychological effect was nearly as important as the military one. The story of Pavlov's division belongs to this period, and it belongs here even though its most famous element has been questioned by historians. The 316th Rifle Division, commanded by General Ivan Pavlov, held the line at Volokholamsk Highway north of Moscow in November 1941, fighting with a ferocity that has been documented from multiple sources. The story of 28 men of the division who stopped a German tank attack at Dubosikovo Junction on November 16, dying to the last man with the words "Russia is a great country, but there is no room to retreat. Moscow is behind us." This story was partly constructed by a journalist named Vasily Grossman, who later admitted he had elaborated the specific dialogue. But what Grossman elaborated was built on something real. The 316th Division fought ferociously, took catastrophic losses, and did not yield. General Pavlov was killed by a mortar fragment on November 18, 2 days after the engagement his men had become famous for. The division that bore his name fought on. On December 5 and 6, 1941, Zhukov launched his counteroffensive. It was not large. It was precisely targeted, attacks against the overextended flanks of the German advance, at the points where the troops were most exhausted and the supply lines most stretched. It worked. Not dramatically, not in a single decisive blow, but steadily kilometer by kilometer. The German forces fell back. Moscow would not be taken. The winter counteroffensive that followed the initial December strikes expanded through January and February of 1942, achieving important successes in some sectors and suffering catastrophic failures in others. The Second Shock Army, under General Andrei Vlasov, was sent deep into German lines near Leningrad to cut the Wehrmacht's supply lines, and was itself cut off and destroyed. Vlasov was captured in July 1942, and would later become the most notorious Soviet traitor of the war, leading a German-sponsored force of Soviet prisoners called the Russian Liberation Army. His capture was the direct result of one of many poorly coordinated Soviet operations in the winter of 1941–42, operations that sent men forward without adequate logistics, without air cover, without the coordination that might have made them succeed. The Red Army was still learning. The learning cost lives at a rate that would have broken any other military force. And yet the Soviet counteroffensive of December 1941 had accomplished the most important thing. It had demonstrated that the Wehrmacht was not invincible, that the German advance could be stopped and reversed, that the Soviet Union had not in fact been defeated in the 8 weeks that Hitler had projected. The myth of German invincibility, which had been one of the most powerful psychological weapons in the Nazi arsenal, was broken at Moscow in the snow in temperatures that reached -40 by men from Siberia who had been told they were the last line of defense. It was enough. For now. The men who walked into German captivity in the summer and fall of 1941 entered a world that was designed to kill them. This is not a retrospective judgment. This was German policy, stated clearly and implemented systematically from the beginning of the campaign. The Commissar Order, issued by the Wehrmacht's Supreme Command on June 6, 1941, 2 weeks before the invasion began, explicitly ordered the summary execution of all Soviet political commissars captured in the field. The Barbarossa jurisdiction decree freed German soldiers from prosecution under military law for crimes against Soviet civilians. And the Hunger Plan, developed by Herbert Back of the Reich Ministry of Food, projected that the German army would feed itself from Soviet agricultural production, with the consequence, explicitly acknowledged in the planning documents, that tens of millions of Soviet civilians would die of starvation. These were not battlefield decisions made in the heat of combat. They were administrative decisions made in offices in Berlin before a single shot was fired. The Dulag, Durchgangslager transit camps were the first stop for captured Soviet soldiers. In the summer and fall of 1941, they were typically nothing more than barbed wire enclosures in open fields, sometimes a stretch of road closed off at both ends. No shelter. No latrine facilities. Minimal food, if any. The prisoners arrived after days of forced marching, many of them already wounded, many already suffering from dysentery from drinking contaminated water in the fields. At the Dulag near Vyazma after the October encirclement, approximately 600,000 prisoners were held in an area designed generously for 1/10 that number. The statistics tell the story. Of the approximately 5.7 million Soviet soldiers who fell into German captivity during the course of the war, roughly 3.3 million, nearly 60%, died in captivity. The majority of those deaths occurred in the first year. For comparison, of the approximately 232,000 British and American prisoners held by Germany, roughly 8,000 died, a mortality rate of about 3.5%. The difference between those two numbers is not a difference of battlefield conditions or military necessity. It is a difference of policy. Nikolai Abrinba was a Soviet artist captured near Kyiv in September 1941 and held at a camp in Uman, in central Ukraine, where approximately 60,000 prisoners were held in an open quarry. He survived by drawing portraits of German guards in exchange for food. His memoir describes the autumn of 1941 with a precision that makes the pages difficult to read. "The men died around me every day," he wrote. "Not quickly, not heroically. They simply lay down and did not get up again. The sounds of the camp were the sounds of men coughing and the sounds of the guards' boots on the stone. By November there were spaces between us where there had been men. I counted the spaces because I could not count the living. There were too many of both. Jewish prisoners were separated on arrival and shot. Political commissars, identified by the red star on their uniform sleeve, were pulled from the columns and executed. German soldiers were ordered to demand that commissars identify themselves, sometimes with promises of better treatment. When they did or were identified by informers, they were shot. These were not improvised decisions by individual commanders. They were orders distributed through the German military chain of command and implemented as standard procedure. The march from the battlefield to the camps was itself often lethal. Guards shot prisoners who fell behind. Prisoners who drank from puddles contaminated with decomposing bodies contracted diseases that killed them days later. In October and November 1941, marching columns of tens of thousands of men passed through Ukrainian villages where local women ran out with bread, only to be driven back by German guards. The bread was left in the mud. The men marched past it. Some escaped. A very small number escaped from the camps themselves, through combinations of luck, ingenuity, and extraordinary will. Mikhail Devyatev was one of them, and his story is worth telling in full because it encompasses almost everything that the experience of Soviet prisoners under German captivity contained, including what happened to survivors after they were liberated. Devyatev had been born in 1917 in Turbivo in Mordovia to a Mordvin peasant family. He was one of 13 children, raised in genuine poverty in a village where electricity arrived only in the 1930s. Before the war he had worked as a river pilot on the Volga and had learned to fly in a flying club, the kind of Soviet institution that trained tens of thousands of young men in basic aviation in the 1930s. When the war began, he became a fighter pilot, eventually rising to lieutenant. He flew combat missions from the first days of the war. He was shot down in July 1944 over German-occupied territory near Lvov and captured. After multiple escape attempts, he was caught each time. He was transferred to a concentration camp at Peenemund, on the island of Uzedom in the Baltic Sea. This was the same island where Germany was developing its V-2 rocket program, the world's first ballistic missile, and the camp was designed specifically to hold prisoners who knew too much to be allowed near anything important. Security was extreme, but Devyatev could see the airfield from his work detail. Over months, memorizing what he observed through gaps in fences and from the edge of his permitted movement, he learned the basic cockpit layout of the Heinkel He-111 medium bombers parked on the field. He learned which aircraft were fueled. He learned the rough sequence of the takeoff procedure. He ate almost nothing during this period. He was already severely malnourished, but he continued to observe. His identity had been switched in a previous camp with that of a dead man, a teacher named Grigory Nikitenko, which meant the camp records showed him as someone with no history of escape attempts. This had saved him from execution as a repeat escapee, and it meant his movements were somewhat less restricted than they might otherwise have been. On February 8, 1945, Devyatev led 9 other prisoners in overpowering a guard on the airfield and seizing a He-111. His fellow escapees were a collection of men he had carefully chosen over weeks, men he believed were physically capable and mentally stable enough for what he was planning. They boarded the aircraft. Devyatev sat in the pilot's seat of an aircraft he had never flown, in a cockpit he had learned from observation and memory, with controls labeled in a language he did not read fluently. The aircraft had been partially sabotaged by mechanics who assumed no prisoner could fly it. He started it anyway, The takeoff was nearly disastrous. The aircraft barely cleared the trees at the runway's end. German fighters scrambled. Devyatev flew at very low altitude across the Baltic, trying to avoid radar detection, while his fellow prisoners watched the sky for interceptors. Soviet anti-aircraft batteries nearly shot him down before a Soviet fighter pilot, investigating the unusual aircraft, came close enough to wave off the gunners. Devyatev landed in Soviet-controlled Poland after a flight of approximately 300 kilometers. He was free. He had brought 9 other men to freedom with him. What happened next was characteristic of Stalin's Soviet Union. Instead of being celebrated, Devyatev was subjected to extended interrogation by Soviet intelligence, who were suspicious of any prisoner who had survived captivity, the assumption being that survival implied collaboration. He was kept under surveillance. He was eventually returned to active duty but was denied recognition. The Soviet rocket program, which had acquired significant value from the intelligence he brought back about the Piedmont facilities, never officially acknowledged his contribution. It was only in 1957, 12 years after the war ended, that Devyatev received the Hero of the Soviet Union title, largely because Sergei Korolev, the chief designer of the Soviet space program and a man who had himself survived the Gulag, vouched specifically for the value of what Devyatev had seen and reported. Korolev had worked at Piedmont after the war as part of the Soviet effort to acquire German rocket technology. He knew the layout. He knew what Devyatev had described. He knew it was accurate. Devyatev lived until 2002, long enough to see the Soviet Union fall and to be interviewed by historians who finally told his story fully. He spent decades as a river pilot on the Volga, the same work he had done before the war on the same river, in a life that contained within it one of the most improbable survivals in the history of the war. For the 3.3 million who did not escape, the historical record is mostly silence. They died in the camps and on the roads and in the fields, and most of what they thought and felt died with them. What survived is the statistics, the German administrative records of their deaths, the testimony of the small number like Abrinba who lived, and the understanding, which became, among Soviet soldiers who learned what had happened to prisoners, something cold and total and implacable, that the enemy they were fighting had made a specific decision about the value of their lives. The families of Soviet prisoners faced their own particular cruelty. Not only the uncertainty about whether their husband or son was alive or dead, which was shared by families of soldiers everywhere, but the specific Soviet political situation around prisoner status. Order 270 of August 1941 had made being captured an offense, and the families of prisoners suffered social and practical consequences. Rations for family members of traitors were reduced. Housing was threatened. Children of men who were prisoners faced discrimination in schools and workplaces. A woman whose husband had been captured at Kyiv in 1941 faced not simply the grief of loss but the social stigma of being related to someone the state defined as a coward or collaborator. These consequences were not hypothetical. They were documented in NKVD records, in the petitions that families sent to authorities, in the memoirs of survivors. Some families destroyed evidence of their relatives' capture, burned letters, denied knowledge, to avoid the consequences. Others discovered, when their husbands or sons returned after the war, that the reunion they had waited for years was followed almost immediately by the man's arrest for the crime of having been captured. The return from captivity was not the end of the ordeal for many Soviet prisoners. In some cases it was the beginning of a second ordeal in a Soviet camp rather than a German one, that lasted years longer. That understanding shaped everything that came after. On September 8, 1941, the last railway line into Leningrad was cut by German forces, and the city of 2.5 million people became an island. Leningrad, the former St. Petersburg, renamed for Lenin after the revolution, was the second largest city in the Soviet Union, the cultural capital, the city of the Hermitage Museum and the Mariinsky Theater and the great libraries and universities and the manufacturing plants that produced a significant fraction of the Soviet Union's heavy industrial equipment. It was also, in the strategic calculus of Operation Barbarossa, a primary objective. Hitler wanted it destroyed. Not captured, destroyed. He had issued a specific order forbidding German forces to accept the city's surrender even if it were offered. Leningrad was to be starved into submission and then leveled. The siege that began on September 8, 1941 and ended on January 27, 1944 lasted 872 days. The death toll is estimated at 1.5 million, military and civilian combined. The majority of those civilian deaths came in the first winter, from starvation, and represent the largest loss of civilian life in a city during any siege in the history of warfare. The rations were reduced systematically as the food reserves were consumed. By November 1941, the daily bread ration for a civilian non-worker was 125 grams. That is roughly the weight of a small apple. Physiologically, 125 grams of the substance being issued as bread, which was not bread in any conventional sense, being made from whatever could be ground into powder and mixed with small amounts of actual flour, sawdust, wallpaper paste, oil cake from seed pressing, clay, provided approximately 300 to 400 calories. A sedentary adult requires 1,500 to 2,000 calories per day to maintain body weight. At 300 to 400 calories, the body begins consuming itself. Muscle tissue goes first, then fat, then organ tissue. Starvation dystrophy, the clinical condition of advanced malnutrition, changes the appearance of a person with specific documented stages. People in the last stages describe themselves as not feeling hungry anymore, which they understood correctly as a very bad sign. Lena Mukina was 17 years old when the siege began, a schoolgirl keeping a diary that was published after the fall of the Soviet Union. Her entries from the first winter have the specific texture of someone trying to maintain normality against an experience that was destroying the concept of normality. November 12th, she wrote, "It is very cold. There is no firewood. I burned 2 chairs today. They didn't last long. I think about food almost constantly now. It is embarrassing, but I cannot stop it." And later, "I dreamed about bread again, white bread, fresh with butter. I woke up and the room was so cold I could see my breath and there was nothing to eat and I cried for the first time in 2 weeks. I don't know why I stopped before. There is plenty to cry about." The Hermitage staff had partially evacuated the museum's collection in the first weeks. 1.1 million objects packed into wooden crates and shipped east on trains. But 1.1 million objects could not be moved. 1 million more remained. The staff who stayed lived in the museum's basement throughout the siege, sleeping among the empty picture frames that had been left on the walls so the collection could be rehung when it returned. The director, Iosif Orbilai, maintained a small team of curators through the entire siege, cataloging damage, protecting what they could, maintaining the institutional identity of the Hermitage under conditions that should have made such maintenance inconceivable. The Hermitage survived. Its director survived. Much of what they protected survived. The zoo remained open. Betty the hippopotamus, too large to evacuate, was bathed daily with a garden hose by her keeper, Elena Dashina, through the entire siege. Hippopotamus skin cracks and bleeds without moisture, and Dashina brought water to Betty through conditions where maintaining one's own hygiene was nearly impossible. Betty survived the siege. So did Dashina. This fact, a hippopotamus bathed daily through 872 days of siege in temperatures that regularly fell to -30, is not a symbol of anything in particular. It is simply one of the things that happened, one of the 10,000 specific human decisions that constituted the siege, that somehow sits in the memory and will not leave. The cannibalism must be acknowledged, because it happened and because denying it would be a disservice to the people who survived it. The NKVD records of Leningrad document approximately 2,000 arrests for cannibalism-related offenses during the siege, almost all of them involving already dead bodies rather than murder, almost all of them by people in the last stages of starvation who had ceased to function morally in any way that a person with adequate calories can judge. These records were suppressed for decades in Soviet accounts of the siege. They are documented in the post-Soviet historical literature, and they belong to the full accounting of what the siege cost. Lake Ladoga, 40 kilometers east of the city, offered the only route in and out. During the summer, boats crossed under Luftwaffe attack. During the first winter, when the lake froze solid, Soviet engineers built the Doroga Zizny, the road of life, across the ice. The ice had to be at least 30 to 40 centimeters thick to support a light vehicle, and much thicker for heavy trucks. Engineers tested the thickness constantly. Roads were marked. Anti-aircraft guns were positioned on the ice to protect the crossing points from air attack. Trucks drove at intervals designed to prevent their weight from setting up resonant vibrations in the ice. They drove with their doors open so that if the ice broke and the truck sank, the driver might have a chance to get out. Some did not get out. Between December 1941 and April 1942, the Road of Life carried approximately 360,000 tons of food and supplies into the city and evacuated approximately 550,000 civilians out of it. It was nowhere near enough to prevent mass starvation. It was enough to keep the city alive. Anton Rubashkin, a schoolteacher whose diary covered the entire siege, wrote on August 9, 1942, the night of the famous Shostakovich concert. They played the 7th Symphony tonight at the Grand Philharmonic. The Leningrad Symphony, they are calling it. Karl Eliasberg conducted. I have heard him conduct before, and tonight he was thin to the point of transparency, but he raised his arms and the music began. The hall was cold enough to see our breath. The windows are boarded. Many of the audience were in uniform, soldiers who had come directly from the front. Outside, during the slow passages, I could hear the artillery. When it was finished, no one moved for a moment. Then we applauded and kept applauding. I do not know precisely what we were applauding. The music, the fact of still being here, the fact that we were doing this, whatever this was, sitting in a concert hall in a besieged city and listening to music. As if civilization had not ended. As if we were insisting it had not ended. I suppose we were. The concert had been broadcast simultaneously over loudspeakers positioned to be heard in German lines. German soldiers later said they heard it. Whether they understood what it meant is another question. The siege of Leningrad was lifted on January 27, 1944, when Soviet forces broke through the German lines. Approximately 1.5 million people had died, military and civilian. The people who survived had done so through a combination of factors. Their position in a rationing hierarchy that gave some more than others, their physical constitution, the help of other people, and what might be called the particular stubbornness of the living, the refusal, repeated on every cold morning, to stop. What happened to Leningrad after the lifting of the siege was a process of excavating what had been preserved and mourning what had not. The museums reopened. The artworks that had been evacuated were returned. The universities resumed their functions. But the demographic wound was enormous. The pre-war population of approximately 3 million had been reduced to perhaps 600,000 by the time the siege ended, through evacuation, death, and the departure of men to the front. The city would not recover its pre-war population for many years. The people who had stayed and survived were marked by the experience in ways that they carried for the rest of their lives. A specific relationship to food that people who have nearly starved often describe, the inability to throw away any edible thing, the instinct to eat whenever eating is possible because the next meal is not guaranteed, even decades later, even in peacetime. Rubashkin, the schoolteacher whose diary covered the entire siege, wrote on January 27, 1944, "The blockade is lifted. I have been in this city for 872 days. I am trying to feel what I expected to feel, and I am having difficulty. There is relief. There is something like joy. And there is also something I did not expect. Grief, not for the dead, which is too large and too familiar, but for the years. I am 46 years old. I spent my 43rd, 44th, and 45th years in a besieged city. These were years of my life. I will not have them back. The city was worth it. I am glad we held. But I am also simply older, in a way that has nothing to do with time." He survived the siege and continued teaching until 1968. His diary was published in part during the Soviet period. The complete version appeared only after 1991. In the summer and fall of 1941, while the battles in the West were consuming the Red Army's mobile forces, an operation was underway in the East that had no precedent in the history of industrial civilization. The Soviet government was moving its factories. Not symbolically, not partially, literally, physically dismantling industrial plants from the threatened western regions and shipping them across thousands of miles to the Ural Mountains in Siberia. The scale of what was actually executed in 1941 exceeded anything that had been planned. Between June and December, approximately 1,523 industrial enterprises, entire factories, were relocated eastward. Steel mills, weapons plants, aircraft factories, tank production facilities. The machinery went first on flat cars. The workers followed. The Kharkov locomotive plant, KHPZ, the factory that had designed and built the T-34 tank, was one of the first to go. As German forces approached Kharkov in September and October 1941, workers dismantled the production lines, loaded them onto trains, and shipped everything to the Ural machine-building plant in Nizhny Tagil, roughly 1,500 kilometers to the east. Production of T-34s resumed at Nizhny Tagil within weeks of the equipment's arrival, in buildings where the walls were not yet complete. The roof was being installed above workers who were already operating the machinery below. In November, in temperatures of -20, Chelyabinsk, a city east of the Ural Mountains that had been a moderately significant industrial center before the war, became something else entirely. The Chelyabinsk tractor factory was combined with evacuated equipment from the Kharkov plant and from the Kirov works in Leningrad, parts of which were dismantled and shipped east even as the siege was beginning, to create what the workers called Tankigrad, Tank City. By 1943, the Chelyabinsk complex was producing a T-34 approximately every 30 minutes. More tanks came out of Tankigrad than from any other single facility in the world. The workers who produced those tanks were not the experienced industrial workers who had operated the factories in Kharkov and Leningrad. Those men were mostly at the front. The workforce at Tankigrad was predominantly women and teenagers, girls of 14 and 15 learning to operate lathes and presses that the men who had designed them had spent years mastering. The Soviet government made a specific and consequential decision to simplify the production processes wherever possible, to reduce the skill required for individual operations so that minimally trained workers could produce consistent output. This was not elegant engineering. It was the engineering of necessity, and it worked. Workers at the evacuated factories in the Urals lived in barracks surrounding the plants, often wooden structures thrown up hastily in the autumn and winter of 1941. They worked 12-hour shifts, sometimes longer. The food ration for factory workers was higher than for ordinary civilians, roughly 700 to 800 calories per day rather than 400, but it was still, by any peacetime standard, severe. People ate and slept and worked and ate again and worked again, and the tanks came out of the factories at the end of the line. The train journeys that brought the workers east belong in any honest account of this period. Workers who rode on open flat cars in November cold, clinging to the machinery they were tasked with protecting, in temperatures that fell below -20. The journey from Kharkov to Nizhny Tagil was roughly 2,000 kilometers. In the autumn of 1941, with German forces advancing and the rail network under extreme strain, some journeys took 2 to 3 weeks. Workers arrived with frostbite. Some workers did not arrive. The railways were the essential element of the entire operation, and the people who kept them running were among the most important workers of the war, though they received almost none of the recognition that soldiers received. Soviet railway workers in 1941 and 1942 worked in conditions that would have shut down any peacetime rail system. Damaged track, bombed bridges, inadequate maintenance equipment, crews working 18 or 20 hours a day. They kept the trains moving because the alternative, the factories staying in place as the Germans arrived, was not acceptable. The results, in terms of production, were extraordinary. In 1941, the Soviet Union produced 6,590 tanks, a number that would have seemed adequate before the war, when the German army had perhaps 3,000. In 1942, production reached 24,446 tanks, despite the loss of the industrial regions that had been captured in 1941. In 1943, it was 24,089. In 1944, it reached 29,000. Germany, in the same period, produced approximately 8,000 to 9,000 tanks per year. The Lend-Lease program from the United States and Britain added a further dimension. Nearly 400,000 trucks, American Studebakers and Dodges and Chevrolets, arrived via the Persian Corridor and Arctic convoys, giving the Red Army a mobility it could not have produced domestically. Radio equipment, crucially, addressed one of the persistent failures of Soviet command, the inability to coordinate across large distances in real time that had been a primary cause of the disasters of 1941. American canned food, the Second Front, Soviet soldiers called it sardonically, in reference to the Allied promises of invasion that kept being delayed, fed millions of men at the front who would otherwise have gone hungry in ways that impaired their ability to fight. Stalin, in a private conversation with Harry Hopkins, Roosevelt's special envoy, admitted something he would never say publicly, that without Lend-Lease, the Soviet Union would have lost the war. Hopkins recorded this in his notes. Whether Stalin believed it fully, whether it was a negotiating position designed to elicit more aid, or whether it was the simple truth spoken in an unguarded moment is impossible to know. What is clear is that the combination of evacuated Soviet industrial capacity and Lend-Lease supply produced, by 1943, a military machine that outproduced Germany in every relevant category. The Germans had planned a short war. They were getting a long one. And in a long war, production is destiny. One of the people responsible for ensuring that production continued was a man named Vyacheslav Malyshev, the People's Commissar for Tank Industry from 1941, who spent the entire war moving between factories in the Urals and Siberia, driving production targets that seemed impossible and receiving them. He was the organizational center of the Soviet tank program, the man who made the specific decisions about which factory would produce which component, who commanded the engineering teams that adapted production processes to the available workers, who pushed the factory directors to meet schedules that left no room for normal industrial management. His diaries from this period, published decades later, describe days that began before dawn and ended after midnight, weeks without a day off, the continuous negotiation between what was needed and what was physically possible given the available workers, materials, and machinery. The factory directors were the other essential figures. Ivan Kozhedub had died of illness in September 1940, the chief designer of the T-34, who never saw his tank used in combat. His successor at the Kharkov plant, Alexander Morozov, was one of the men who oversaw the relocation to Nizhny Tagil. Morozov spent the move on trains and then in the Ural snow, supervising the reinstallation of machinery in buildings whose walls were still unfinished, arguing with workers who were exhausted and cold and frightened, solving problems that had no precedent because nothing like this had ever been done before. The T-34 that Soviet crews drove into battle in 1942 and 1943 was largely the same machine that had been designed in Kharkov, but it was now being produced by people and in a place that had not existed as an industrial entity 2 years before. The workers themselves were not given the option of not working. Factory workers were subject to military-style discipline. Absenteeism could be prosecuted as desertion. Working too slowly could be characterized as sabotage. The NKVD maintained a presence in every major factory. But coercion was not the only motivation at work. Many of the workers were there because family members were at the front, and they understood with specific clarity that the tank they were building might be the tank that brought their husband or son home. The personal stakes were not abstract. By the summer of 1942, the relocated and expanded Soviet industrial complex was producing more tanks than Germany, more aircraft than Germany, more artillery pieces than Germany. The weapons looked different. The T-34's welded hull was cruder than German tank fabrication. The aircraft interiors were Spartan compared to what German pilots flew. But they worked, they were produced in sufficient quantity to equip an army, and they were being driven and flown by men who were developing the skills to use them effectively. The industrial equation had shifted. The military equation would follow. Hitler's plan for the summer of 1942 was not to attack Moscow. The failure of the winter offensive, the shock of the Soviet counterattack in December, the realization that the Wehrmacht was not invincible, had led to a strategic reassessment. Moscow was not the prize that would end the war. The prize was the oil of the Caucasus, the wells at Maykop and Grozny, and the enormous deposits at Baku on the Caspian Sea, which produced 90% of the Soviet Union's petroleum. Without oil, Soviet tanks and aircraft and trucks would stop. Without Caucasian oil, Germany's own military machine, which ran on a combination of Romanian crude and synthetic fuel from coal that was never quite adequate, would have a permanent, abundant supply. The plan was called Fall Blau Case Blue. Army Group South would split. Army Group A would drive south into the Caucasus. Army Group B would drive east to the Volga River, securing the operation's northern flank and cutting the waterway that carried Soviet oil and supplies from the Caspian. The Volga crossing point that Army Group B needed to secure lay at a city named Stalingrad. The German summer offensive began in June 1942 with initial results that replicated the disasters of 1941. Soviet forces encircled, hundreds of thousands of prisoners taken, vast distances covered in days. Army Group A drove into the Caucasus foothills with a speed that left German commanders almost giddy. On August 21st, a group of mountain troops from the 1st Mountain Division climbed Elbrus, the highest peak in Europe, at 5,642 meters, and planted a German war flag on the summit. The gesture was purely symbolic. Elbrus was not a military objective and its capture accomplished nothing. But it felt like the top of the world, and in August 1942 the German army was standing on it. Army Group B's 6th Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, advanced across the open steppe toward Stalingrad in the August heat. The steppe in summer is a specific landscape. Flat, featureless, impossibly large, baked to a pale gold by the sun. German soldiers marching east through it described the disorientation of a horizon that never changed, a landscape that offered no landmarks, no shade, no water. The dust raised by the columns could be seen from miles away. The heat was crushing. And at the end of the steppe, the city. On August 23, 1942, the Luftwaffe launched its opening attack on Stalingrad itself. Approximately 600 aircraft flew roughly 1,000 sorties over the course of the day, dropping incendiary and high-explosive bombs on a city that was still full of civilians. The evacuation had been delayed by Soviet authorities who did not want to create panic. The resulting fires were visible 100 kilometers away. The bombing killed an estimated 40,000 civilians in a single day. The city that the 6th Army approached was already burning when its lead elements reached the western suburbs. What they entered in September would be unlike anything in the experience of modern warfare. General Vasily Ivanovich Chukov took command of the Soviet 62nd Army in September 1942, the formation responsible for the direct defense of Stalingrad. He was 42 years old, a man of blunt intelligence and enormous physical courage, who had been the Soviet military advisor in China when the German invasion began and had maneuvered through the politics of a system that shot generals for failures until he found himself commanding the most important single formation in the war. His command post was established in a series of tunnels and bunkers immediately above the Volga bank, sometimes only 150 meters from German positions. He was determined never to retreat across the river. What was on the western bank of the Volga would be held. He would fight in the burning city until there was nothing left of either the city or the army, or until the Germans gave up. He issued his orders accordingly. Stalin's Order 227, not one step back, had been issued in July 1942, codifying what was already in practice. No unauthorized retreat, blocking detachments positioned behind Soviet lines with authority to shoot men who fell back without orders. The order has become, in Western accounts of Stalingrad, a symbol of Soviet coercion, and the coercion was real. The blocking detachments existed. Men were shot for retreating. But Order 227 has also been simplified in its use as an explanation for why the Red Army fought so hard at Stalingrad. The men who held the grain elevator and Pavlov's house and the factory floors of the Red October plant were not fighting because they feared their own blocking detachments more than the German army. They were fighting because they had been told, and many of them believed, from personal experience in the occupied territories, that what awaited the Soviet Union if Germany won was worse than what awaited them in a fighting position. Order 227 formalized a determination that had already been arrived at from other directions. The political significance of the city added another dimension. Stalin had named it for himself in 1925, changing it from Tsaritsyn to Stalingrad in commemoration of his role in the defense of the city during the Civil War. When Hitler publicly committed to taking it, and Stalin publicly committed to holding it, the battle acquired a symbolic weight that no military calculation could fully account for. Both dictators had made Stalingrad into a referendum on their own authority. In this sense, the battle was partly determined before a single shot was fired in the ruins of the city, determined by the specific egos and specific totalitarian political structures of the two men who held ultimate authority over the armies fighting there. The city that the 6th Army entered in September 1942 was not a city in any conventional sense. It was a wasteland of burnt-out buildings and rubble heaps, of craters filled with groundwater that smelled of ash and oil, of massive industrial structures made of reinforced concrete and heavy steel that had been designed to survive industrial accidents and proved, by accident, nearly impervious to artillery and air bombardment. The battle for Stalingrad was not one continuous thing. It was a series of distinct phases, each with its own character, each producing its own specific proofs of human endurance. The initial assault in August and September, when the German forces reached the city and began fighting through its suburbs. The October battles for the factory district, when the fighting moved into the reinforced concrete industrial complexes that became the defining landscape of the battle. The November stalemate, when the front inside the city had stabilized into a complex of contested buildings and no man's lands. Each phase was experienced differently by the soldiers inside it. The men who fought in September 1942 were fighting in a city that still had some physical structure. Damaged buildings, streets that were still streets. The men who fought in November 1942 were fighting in a landscape that the battle had transformed into something with no peacetime equivalent. Rubble hills and concrete fragments and underground passages and surface craters. A terrain that its inhabitants learned to read as carefully as a hunter reads a forest. Every Soviet soldier who fought in Stalingrad came to the city the same way. Across the Volga at night, in boats and ferries, under German artillery and aerial bombardment. The river was 800 meters wide. The crossing took 15 to 20 minutes each way. German aircraft dropped flares to illuminate the crossing points. The flares turned the night into a cold, shadowless day that made every moving vessel visible. German artillery had the ranges pre-calculated. The sailors who ran the ferries became, by the mathematics of the thing, among the most exposed men in Stalingrad, crossing and recrossing the same 800 meters of water night after night with full knowledge of what waited for them. Lieutenant Colonel Sidor Kovshenenko, who commanded a ferry regiment, kept records through the battle. In September alone, his regiment made over 1,000 crossings and lost approximately 35% of its boats. The men who survived the crossing arrived on the western bank in darkness, their first experience of Stalingrad being the smell. Vasily Grossman, the war correspondent who visited the city in October, described it as a smell unlike anything I have experienced before or since. Burning mixed with things that should not burn. Rubber. Something chemical. And under all of it, the smell of turned earth. The deep subsoil smell of shell craters. The smell that becomes, for anyone who has been in heavy bombardment, the permanent marker of what war is. Chukov's tactical instruction was specific and counterintuitive. Keep Soviet positions within 30 to 50 meters of German lines at all times. The reason was straightforward. The Luftwaffe could not provide close air support at distances under 50 meters without hitting its own troops. German artillery could not fire accurately at targets that close to their own infantry. By staying within arm's reach of the enemy, the Soviets negated the two tools that had been most decisive in the German army's victories everywhere else. What remained was infantry fighting at close quarters, where the Red Army soldiers, motivated, experienced, defending ground they had been explicitly told was the last ground available, proved to be the Germans' equal. The factory complexes became the landmarks and the fortresses of the battle. The Red October Steel Factory, the Barricades Artillery Factory, the Stalingrad Tractor Factory, these were not ordinary buildings. Built in the early 1930s as monuments to Soviet industrial ambition, they covered enormous areas and were constructed of materials that had been designed to withstand the most extreme industrial accidents. German engineers who attempted to collapse their structures with artillery found that the reinforced concrete absorbed or deflected shell after shell. A building that would have been reduced to rubble in any other city became, in Stalingrad, a fortress that could be fought through room by room but never simply destroyed from a distance. The basement fighting was among the worst of the war. In the sub-basements of the factory buildings, there was no light at all. Men navigated by touch, by sound, by the feel of the floor under their feet and the proximity of walls. A thrown grenade in a confined space was as dangerous to the thrower as to the target. Men on opposite sides of a thin concrete wall could hear each other breathing. German soldiers called the entire battle Rattenkrieg, rat war, and the term captures something precise. The reduction of mechanized modern warfare to its most primitive form, one man against another man in a dark space, with the advantage going to whoever was more frightened of dying. Anatoly Chekhov, no relation to the playwright, was a 19-year-old sniper in the 62nd Army who kept a diary through the Stalingrad battle, later published in a veteran's anthology. His entries described the specific psychological texture of the fighting from the perspective of a man who spent his days in stillness, watching, and his nights moving. October 4th, he wrote, shot 2 today. 1 in the morning through a window. 1 in the afternoon he was trying to reach a water source. I think about what I am doing less than I expected. I think about the mechanics, the angle, the wind, the breath. After, I think about what we will eat. He does not describe guilt or satisfaction. He describes a man who has become very good at a specific task and is thinking about the task. The Soviet hugging tactic was psychological as well as tactical. German soldiers who had fought in France and Poland and Yugoslavia had learned a specific rhythm to combat. Advance, suppress, maneuver, exploit. That rhythm required space, required the ability to separate from the enemy long enough to use supporting arms. Stalingrad denied them the space. German soldiers described the specific frustration of finding that every technique they had mastered was suddenly wrong, that their training, their doctrine, their accumulated experience told them to do things that in this specific context resulted in death. Into this landscape, in September 1942, came Vasily Zaitsev. He was 26 years old, from a village in the Ural Mountains called Yeleninka. His grandfather had taught him to hunt as a child in the forests around the Ural River, how to move without sound, how to read terrain, how to control breathing, how to wait without fidgeting for hours if hours were what the shot required. He had been a Navy clerk before the war, stationed in Vladivostok, as far from the front as it was possible to be and still be on Soviet territory. When the call came for volunteers to join the infantry fighting at Stalingrad, he joined. He arrived across the Volga at night in a boat under shellfire with a standard-issue Mosin-Nagant rifle that he had not yet fired at a human being. His performance in his first engagements caught the attention of his commanding officer, and he was given a scoped rifle and assigned to work as a sniper, a role that, in the Stalingrad landscape, was one of the most important and most dangerous in the battle. The city was perfect sniper terrain. Rubble piles offered concealment. Sight lines ran through broken buildings for hundreds of meters. The destruction had created a landscape of shadows and angles that a skilled shooter could read and exploit. Zaitsev read it with the specific literacy of someone who had grown up learning to read a different but structurally similar landscape. He developed what his students later called the three-to-a-nest system. 2 snipers and an observer working together, never firing from the same position twice, never moving during daylight if it could be avoided, spending days observing a sector before taking a shot, identifying German sniper positions by the movement of dust, the glint of a lens, the pattern of small disturbances in the rubble. He trained other snipers using the same principles: patience before action, observation before engagement, terrain reading before movement, and the network of Soviet snipers he helped create exerted a psychological pressure on German forces in his sector that went beyond the casualty count. German soldiers in areas where Zaitsev's group was active began moving differently: shorter sprints, more cover, greater reluctance to stand near windows or occupy predictable positions. The city taught them to be afraid of specific places and times, and that fear had tactical consequences. His confirmed kills at Stalingrad were eventually recorded at 242. The actual number was certainly higher, as not every kill could be confirmed according to the verification standards the Soviet military applied. The famous duel with the German sniper master he referred to in his memoir as Thorvald, sometimes called Heinz Thorvald or Koenig in various tellings, is a story that historians have debated extensively. What is agreed upon is that the Germans did send specialist snipers to counter the effect that Soviet snipers were having, and that some of these specialists were themselves killed by Soviet counterparts. Whether the specific duel Zaitsev described happened exactly as he described it is uncertain. What is not uncertain is the psychological reality that it captured. 2 men, each supremely skilled, each hunting the other through a landscape of rubble and shadow, each knowing that the other was out there and was better than ordinary men. The myth of the duel, whatever its literal accuracy, captures something true about what Stalingrad was. A place where extraordinary skill and patience and control had become the currency of survival. Zaitsev was wounded in January 1943. A blinding flash from a mortar fragment damaged both his eyes, and he was evacuated across the Volga for surgery. The surgeon who operated on him was Semen Fyodorov, one of the Soviet Union's leading ophthalmologists, who had been brought to the Stalingrad region specifically because the battle was producing so many eye injuries. Fyodorov restored his sight. He returned to the front. He survived the war. After the war, he became the director of a textile engineering institute in Kyiv, a profession so remote from Stalingrad that it almost constitutes a statement in itself about how completely life can transform around an experience. He died in 1991, the year the Soviet Union ceased to exist, and was buried with full military honors. In 2006, his remains were reinterred in Volgograd, the city that had been Stalingrad, in a ceremony attended by veterans who had fought there 6 decades earlier. The house Pavlov is worth returning to here, because its story contains within it something about the nature of defense that the entire battle illuminated. Yakov Pavlov was a sergeant, 24 years old, from Novgorod. In September 1942, he was ordered to take a group of soldiers to reconnoiter and, if possible, hold an apartment building on Solokhnaya Street, a four-story pre-war residential building that offered commanding fields of fire over a large open square. He reached the building with 4 men. They cleared it. He reported back that the building was viable as a defensive position. He was told to hold it with whatever force could be spared. The force that could be spared was roughly 25 men, eventually growing to approximately 50 as the position's importance became clear. They were from at least 9 different Soviet nationalities: Russians, Ukrainians, Kazakhs, Georgians, Uzbeks, Tatars, a Jew, and Abkhazian. They dug anti-tank ditches around the building. They punched holes in the walls connecting it to adjacent structures so they could move between buildings without crossing open ground. They mined the approaches. They established firing positions in the basement, on the middle floors, and in the attic, creating overlapping fields of fire that covered every approach. They held the building for 58 days. In that time, German forces made repeated attempts to take it. They brought artillery. They brought tanks. They brought engineers with demolition charges. Each attack was repulsed. The building became a node in the Soviet defense. German forces could not advance past it because any advance would be flanked from the building's fire. The building that Pavlov held was not a fortress in any architectural sense. It was a set of walls and floors that men had decided to defend, and the decision was as much the fortress as the structure. When Soviet forces relieved the position in November 1942, after the encirclement of the German forces, Pavlov was still there. He had been wounded, had sent back his most severely wounded men when there were opportunities, had maintained the position's communications with the main line, had fought for 58 days in a single building without being defeated. A Soviet general later remarked that the Germans had lost more men trying to take Pavlov's house than they had lost taking Paris. The comment has a rhetorical quality, but it points to something real. The cost of urban defense, maintained by determined men in a solid position, made some objectives effectively impregnable regardless of the attacking force's size. Pavlov survived the war. He was made a hero of the Soviet Union. After the war, he became a collective farm chairman in Novgorod Oblast, then served in the Soviet Communist Party apparatus, and eventually became a monk in the Russian Orthodox Church, a trajectory that says something about the range of roads that led away from Stalingrad, and the kinds of meaning that men who had been there found or did not find in the decades afterward. 2 men became symbols of the Stalingrad close-quarters war, though in different ways and in different registers. Vasily Grigoryevich Zaitsev was 25 years old when he arrived at Stalingrad in September 1942. He had been born in 1915 in Yeleninskoye, a village in the southern Ural Mountains, to a hunter's family. His grandfather, in the tradition of rural Siberia, had taught him to hunt from childhood. This meant learning things that no classroom taught: how to read the landscape for cover and movement, how to control breathing so that the body becomes still enough to shoot accurately, how to sit motionless and cold for hours while watching for a target that might appear for 1 second and then never appear again. He had arrived at Stalingrad as a ship's clerk in the Soviet Navy's land formations. The Navy had extensive ground units, and in his first weeks had shot his first 3 German soldiers in a single day using a standard infantry rifle, before he was even issued a proper sniper's weapon. His commanding officer noticed. He was given a scoped rifle assigned to sniper operations, and within weeks had become one of the most effective individual fighters in the 62nd Army. His technique, described in detail in the training materials he later wrote at the request of the political department, was methodical. He would spend the first hour or 2 of any session simply observing, building a mental map of German positions and movement patterns, noting which windows reflected light at what angle at which time of day, noting which rubble heaps showed signs of recent disturbance. He did not shoot at random. He waited for targets he had reasoned about in advance and that he believed he could hit with 1 shot, because a second shot revealed a position. He trained approximately 28 other snipers over the course of the battle, a group the political officers called his Zykata, his Leverets, his Rabbits. His instruction materials survive in Soviet military archives and describe his method with the precision of a craftsman who has thought carefully about his craft. Among his specific instructions, always position yourself with the light source behind you, always have multiple exit routes from any position, Never fire from the same position twice in the same day. When uncertain of a target, wait. An uncertain shot that misses is more dangerous than no shot because it reveals you. The duel with the German master sniper arrived in November 1942. German high command had sent their best. A man the Soviets identified as Major Erwin Koenig of the German sniper school, though some historians have questioned whether this specific individual existed or whether Zaitsev conflated several encounters into a single narrative. Whether the duel was precisely as described in the most famous version is uncertain. What is not uncertain is that a specific campaign of countersniper activity occurred in November 1942 in which Zaitsev identified and eliminated a German marksman who had been targeting Soviet snipers specifically. He described the process in his memoirs. For several days, he and a partner observed a section of front where Soviet snipers had been killed with unusual precision. Shots that suggested the shooter knew where they were before they revealed themselves. Zaitsev identified the likely firing position by process of elimination. A damaged tank and a sheet of corrugated metal near a ruined building that gave angles on the positions where Soviet snipers had been killed. He positioned himself at a distance, facing the sun, knowing that whoever was behind that sheet of metal would have the sun in their eyes if they looked his direction in the morning. He waited 2 days. On the third morning, a helmet appeared above the sheet of metal. Zaitsev did not shoot at the helmet. He waited. Then something shifted, an eye or a scope lens catching the light. He fired. His partner watched through his own scope. The figure slumped. It did not move again. The story became legend, the subject of a 2001 film, the source of 1,000 retelling variations. The core of it is documented. Zaitsev shot 225 confirmed kills during the Battle of Stalingrad. His students accounted for over 1,000 more. He survived the battle, lost his sight temporarily to a mortar explosion in January 1943, recovered it after surgery in Moscow, returned to the front and survived the war. He died in 1991, 1 month after the Soviet Union dissolved. Yakov Fedotovich Pavlov, the second man, the sergeant whose house became a fortress, was 23 years old in September 1942, a collective farmer from Novgorod Oblast who had been in the army since 1940. He led a 4-man reconnaissance group into an apartment building on Penzinskaya Street on September 27th, a 4-story residential building that had been evacuated when the battle reached it, and found it temporarily abandoned by German forces. He recognized immediately that the building commanded a large open square and was a natural defensive position. He sent word back to his company commander, Lieutenant Ivan Afanasyev, who sent 24 more soldiers. Together with the civilians who had been hiding in the basement, Russians, Ukrainians, several children, an old man who refused to leave, Pavlov's garrison dug in. The defenders were a cross-section of Soviet nationality that the political officers ensured was recorded and publicized. Russians, Ukrainians, Georgians, Kazakhs, Tatars, Uzbeks. This was deliberate Soviet propaganda, but it was also true. The 62nd Army at Stalingrad drew from across the Soviet Union's constituent peoples, and a small garrison holding a single building was likely to reflect that diversity simply by virtue of who had been assigned to that regiment, that company, that platoon. The multi-ethnic nature of the defense was real, even if the specific emphasis on it served a political purpose. Sergeant Alexei Chekalov was the garrison's combat engineer, responsible for maintaining the weapons through the siege. He improvised parts from the rubble of the building and the surrounding area, kept the machine guns functioning when the mechanisms needed repair, and built into the building's interior a series of modifications that made it militarily more effective. The knockout holes between apartments that allowed movement without crossing exposed stairwells, the firing ports at ground level that allowed anti-tank weapons to engage approaching vehicles from angles that minimized return fire. The political officer assigned to the house was Lieutenant Alexander Dragan, who maintained the daily schedule of the garrison, watch rotations, ammunition allocation, the discipline of a small military unit under siege conditions, with a consistency that prevented the garrison from degrading into mere survival mode. For 58 days, Pavlov's house held. Tanks came. It held. Artillery was directed at it. It held. Engineers tunneled toward it, slowly, carefully, from the ruins of adjacent buildings. The garrison detected the sound of digging and dug counter-approaches. Resupply came through a narrow trench that connected the building to the Soviet lines 50 meters away, at night in small quantities. Men were killed and replaced. The total number of defenders at any given time remained roughly 30. German military maps of Stalingrad that have survived the war show Pavlov's building marked as a fortified strong point, the designation they used for major defensive works requiring significant engineering and artillery resources to overcome. A building held by 30 men was, on their operational maps, equivalent to a fortress. Grossman visited Stalingrad during the fighting and wrote about the building in his notebooks. "These men," he wrote, "have held this building longer than France." The comparison was not precise. France fell in 6 weeks and fell completely. Pavlov's house was 1 point in a battle that lasted months. But the moral weight of the comparison was correct. What Pavlov's garrison demonstrated was that ordinary men, given adequate reason and adequate leadership, could hold a position against a military machine that had conquered a continent. Pavlov survived the war. He later became a monk, taking the monastic name Kirill. He died in 1981. On the morning of November 19, 1942, Soviet forces north and south of Stalingrad struck simultaneously. The planning for Operation Uranus, the encirclement of the German forces at Stalingrad, had been conducted in the highest secrecy through the autumn. Generals Zhukov and Vasilevsky had visited the front separately, disguised as ordinary officers, to assess the position personally. The forces assembled for the operation were moved only at night, trucks with headlights off, tanks transported on flat cars and offloaded in forests away from any observation point. Soviet radio traffic in the staging areas was carefully managed. Minimal transmissions, dummy traffic in other sectors suggesting activity that wasn't there, the silence of preparation instead of the noise of it. The specific weakness that the plan exploited was the flanks of the German position at Stalingrad. The Sixth Army's line curved north and south from the city, and the outer ends of that line were held not by German soldiers but by Allied forces. The Romanian Third Army in the north, the Romanian Fourth Army and Italian Eighth Army in the south. These were not bad soldiers by the standards of their own national armies, but they lacked what they needed for what was coming, specifically anti-tank weapons capable of stopping a Soviet T-34. Romanian anti-tank guns fired rounds that bounced off T-34 armor. Their soldiers carried rifles against a tank attack. When the Soviet armor came through, they could do nothing. The barrage on November 19 opened at 7:30 a.m., 3,500 guns firing simultaneously. In the Romanian Third Army's sector, observers described the ground literally shaking in a continuous rolling motion, like water. Men in bunkers 30 meters deep were thrown from their positions. The sound was audible in Stalingrad, 50 kilometers away. When the guns stopped and the Soviet tanks rolled forward, the Romanian Third Army disintegrated. Not from cowardice, from impossibility. There was nothing their weapons could do against what they faced. Romanian soldiers who survived described watching Soviet tanks drive through their positions and pass them as if they weren't there, driving south into the German rear while the Romanian infantry stood at the sides of the road. In the south, the same thing happened to the Italian and Romanian forces on the opposite flank. The encirclement closed at Kalakondan, on the Don River 50 miles west of Stalingrad, on November 22. The 26th Tank Corps from the north and the 4th Mechanized Corps from the south drove toward each other and met at a bridge over the Don that Soviet forces had seized intact, a stroke of luck that may have saved days of time. The lead tank commanders recognized each other's vehicles, flashed recognition signals, and shook hands on the bridge. When they did, approximately 330,000 German, Romanian, Italian, and Croatian soldiers were inside the ring. Paulus received the news and immediately radioed Army Group B requesting permission to break out to the west. Hitler denied it within hours. He would not permit the retreat. The Sixth Army would hold Stalingrad and await relief. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein was ordered to assemble a relief force, Operation Winterstorm, to break through to the encircled army from the south. Manstein drove northeast through the steppe in December, pushing his forces to their limits. He got within 45 miles of the encirclement before Soviet counterattacks stopped him and forced him to withdraw. Inside the ring, the Kessel, the Cauldron, 330,000 men faced a winter that was killing them faster than Soviet bullets could. Göring had promised Hitler that the Luftwaffe could supply the encircled army by air. He said 300 to 500 tons per day. The Luftwaffe managed, on its best days, approximately 150 tons. On most days it delivered far less. The average over the entire airlift was approximately 100 tons, 1/3 of the minimum necessary to keep the army functional. The transport aircraft flew through blizzards and against Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft fire that grew heavier as Soviet forces tightened the encirclement. In the last weeks, the airfields inside the pocket were under Soviet artillery fire, and transport aircraft landed and unloaded in minutes before German shells landed on the runway. German Private Hans Dill from Württemberg kept a diary in the cauldron. The entries from December 1942 described the progressive collapse of military order into mere survival. December 14th. Ration today was 200 grams of bread. Some horse meat. The horse was already dead before we got it. I ate every piece. I have never been this hungry in my life. I think about food constantly. Not about home. Not about the war. About food. A bowl of soup. Piece of bread with anything on it. Is this what the people in Leningrad feel? I begin to understand things I did not understand before. On January 12th, his final entry. I am sick. Everyone is sick. We keep fighting because there is nothing else to do. The formal surrender came in two parts. Paulus, promoted to Field Marshal by Hitler on January 30th, 1943, in a gesture that was transparently a suggestion that no German Field Marshal should allow himself to be captured, surrendered the southern pocket on January 31st. The northern pocket surrendered on February 2nd. 91,000 men marched into Soviet captivity. Of the original 330,000 who had been encircled in November, approximately 150,000 had died in the cauldron. Of the 91,000 prisoners who began the march east in temperatures of -30, fewer than 6,000 would ever return to Germany. The German prisoners who survived the march were distributed among a system of Soviet POW camps, the same system that Soviet prisoners had entered from the other direction in 1941, with equally catastrophic results, though for different reasons. Soviet camps were not run on a policy of deliberate extermination, as the German camps had been, but they were chronically underfunded, inadequately supplied, and rife with disease in a country that had itself been devastated. The mortality rate among German POWs in Soviet captivity, approximately 30 to 35% overall, was lower than the 60% Soviet mortality rate in German camps but vastly higher than the mortality rates of Western Allied prisoners in German captivity. Many German survivors would not be repatriated until 1955, 10 years after the war ended. Paulus himself survived captivity and eventually cooperated with Soviet authorities, recording statements and appearing at the Nuremberg trials as a prosecution witness. He later moved to East Germany, where he lived until 1957, a figure of contempt for many of his former comrades who saw his cooperation with the Soviets as a final betrayal after the supreme sacrifice that had been demanded of the men under his command. Whether Paulus betrayed anything or was simply a man trying to survive in an impossible situation, having been placed in that situation by orders he followed from a leader he could not refuse, is a question that admits of no clean answer. Field Marshal Friedrich von Paulus died in February 1957 in Dresden, in the German Democratic Republic. He was buried with military honors. The men of the 6th Army who died in the cauldron were buried in the ground near Stalingrad, in graves that were not individually marked, that have been researched by German war grave commissions for decades since, and that are still not fully accounted for. Vasily Grossman was at Stalingrad when Paulus surrendered. He had been there on and off since September, one of the Soviet war correspondents whose dispatches appeared in Krasnaya Zvezda, the Red Star, and were read by millions of people throughout the Soviet Union. He was not a typical war correspondent. He was a novelist, trained as a chemist, author of a pre-war novel about the Donbass mining industry, a man whose intellectual formation included a deep familiarity with European literature and a moral seriousness that the propaganda requirements of his job tested constantly. Grossman had been born in 1905 in Berdychiv, Ukraine, to an assimilated Jewish family. His mother, Yekaterina Grossman, had remained in Berdychiv when the Germans arrived. She was among the approximately 30,000 Jews of Berdychiv murdered in mass shootings in September 1941, in pits at the edge of the city. Grossman did not learn the full details until later in the war, and he could not say so publicly. Soviet propaganda, for reasons of its own, did not specifically acknowledge the German program of genocide against Jews, framing the killing instead as crimes against Soviet citizens. He eventually wrote his mother a letter that could not be sent, which has survived in his papers. I know that you are no longer among the living. I know about the mass murders. They didn't spare anyone. The letter was not published during his lifetime. In his war notebooks from February 1943, he described walking through Stalingrad the day after the last German surrender. I walked from the Volga to the factory district and back. I have been here since autumn and I have never seen the city in full daylight without smoke before. The guns are quiet. What I saw was this. There are no buildings. Not in the sense of damaged buildings or partially standing buildings. There are shapes. Facades where a wall still stands, the concrete skeletons of the factories which nothing could destroy. But there are no buildings in the sense of structures where human beings could live or work. There are rubble heaps, miles of them. And in the rubble, a frozen arm extending from a snowdrift. A boot. A truck with its cab crushed flat by something very large. And among these, soldiers. Living Soviet soldiers walking upright in daylight for the first time in months. Some were laughing. One man I saw was standing in the middle of a street looking at nothing in particular. When I approached him, he turned to look at me with an expression I cannot describe. He was not hurt. He was simply looking at what had been done to the world and trying to understand what it meant. I did not know what to tell him. In Germany, the news of Stalingrad reached the public on February 3, 1943. Goebbels announced it on the radio, framing it as a heroic sacrifice. 3 days of national mourning were declared. And in the private diaries of ordinary Germans, sources that historians have worked through exhaustively since the war, the response was different from the public framing. Friedrich Kellner was a court official in the small town of Laubach who had been keeping a secret diary critical of the regime since 1939. His entry for February 5, 1943, "The catastrophe at Stalingrad has shaken up many people. The realization is beginning to penetrate that this war cannot be won by Germany. The Führer has deceived us completely." Lore Walb, a Berlin housewife, wrote, "Something has broken. I cannot say precisely what. It is as if a machine running at very high speed has developed a vibration. Small, perhaps, but the kind that tells you the machine is not sound." These were not the words of political opponents of the regime. They were ordinary Germans confronting evidence that the story they had been told, the story of inevitable German victory, was false. Goebbels gave a famous speech at the Berlin Sportpalast on February 18, 1943, the Total War speech, in which he asked a carefully selected audience whether they wanted total war, and they roared yes. The speech was a masterpiece of framing catastrophe as destiny. But catastrophe it was. Stalingrad had destroyed an army, consumed the strategic reserve, and demonstrated to anyone willing to see it that the Red Army was not finished. It had not even reached its peak. What the Stalingrad campaign had cost the Soviet Union is also worth recording, alongside the German losses. Soviet casualties in the Stalingrad campaign, from the beginning of the German advance to the final Soviet counteroffensive, numbered approximately 1.1 million killed and wounded. The 62nd Army, which had defended the city itself, was a shadow of a fighting formation by the time Operation Uranus closed the ring. Chukov's men had held the city but had been almost entirely consumed in holding it. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad was paid for in blood at roughly the same rate as the German defeat. Both sides destroyed the other, and the Soviets happened to have more men, more tanks, more artillery arriving to replace what they lost. The men who survived the Battle of Stalingrad itself were not celebrated in the way that might be imagined. The army needed them somewhere else. Chukov's 62nd Army was redesignated the 8th Guards Army after Stalingrad, the Guards title being the Soviet military's highest honorific designation, and sent to fight again immediately in the continuing campaigns of the war. There was no recuperation, no victory parade for the men who had held the city. The war was too large and too urgent for that. The 91,000 German and Axis soldiers who surrendered at Stalingrad entered a captivity whose conditions would kill the majority of them within a year. They were marched, those who could walk, across the steppe in February temperatures that were extreme even by Russian standards. Many died on the march before reaching the collection camps. Those who reached the camps found conditions that were, in some specific ways, a mirror image of what Soviet prisoners had experienced in German camps. Inadequate food, no medical care for the wounded, housing in barracks designed for a fraction of the number being held. This was not entirely deliberate policy. The Soviet prisoner of war system in early 1943 was overwhelmed, operating with resources that were themselves desperately short in a country fighting for its existence. But the effect on the prisoners was the same whether the cause was policy or incapacity. They died in large numbers. Of the approximately 91,000 Germans and Axis soldiers taken at Stalingrad, around 6,000 eventually returned to Germany. The rest died in captivity from disease, exposure, malnutrition, or the consequences of wounds received in the battle. The majority died in the first year. By late 1943, the original Stalingrad prisoners numbered in the tens of thousands rather than the tens of thousands who had surrendered. Among the survivors was Friedrich Paulus himself. He was held in various Soviet facilities through the remainder of the war, and the Soviets made use of him. He appeared on Soviet broadcasts calling on German soldiers to surrender and on German officers to recognize that the war was lost. He joined the National Committee for a Free Germany, a Soviet-sponsored organization of German prisoners and exiles who opposed Hitler. His political evolution in captivity was genuine by some accounts, calculated by others. It is, in any case, an interesting question what it means to change one's convictions under the specific pressures of Soviet captivity, and whether the sincerity of the change alters its moral weight. After the war ended, Paulus remained in Soviet custody until 1953, when he was released. He settled in East Germany, in Dresden, where he gave occasional interviews and wrote his memoirs, and where he died in 1957. He never returned to West Germany. Whether this reflected genuine political conviction or the specific situation of a man who had made statements in Soviet captivity that made the West German government uncomfortable with him, or both, is another question that his story leaves open. The Paulus who surrendered in Stalingrad in February 1943 was a man who had been following orders his entire career, orders from above, always from above, and who had followed the final order, the order not to retreat, to the point of destroying the army entrusted to his command. He was not a monster. He was something more ordinary and perhaps more troubling. A capable officer who had subordinated his own military judgment to political authority at the moments when military judgment was most urgently needed, and who paid for that subordination with an army, and who saw clearly only after the army was gone what should have been seen before. There were many such men in the German officer corps. Paulus was simply the one whose failure was so spectacular that it became impossible to ignore. The spring and summer of 1943 brought both sides time to recover, rebuild, and plan. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein stabilized the German front through a series of skillful defensive operations, his backhand blow. The strategic concept of allowing a Soviet advance to overextend, then striking its flanks with mobile reserves. His recapture of Kharkov in March 1943, the third time the city had changed hands, each exchange consuming thousands of lives, was the last significant German offensive success in the East. It demonstrated that Manstein was still capable of operational genius even with reduced resources. It also produced the Kursk salient, a large westward bulge in the front where the Soviet winter offensives had pushed the German line back. Manstein's operation to retake Kharkov, the Donetsk campaign of February-March 1943, is worth understanding because it shows what the German army could still do at its best in 1943 with competent leadership and a coherent plan. After Stalingrad, the Soviet offensives had been so successful that the front near Kharkov had become dangerously overextended. Soviet tank units had driven deep into German-held territory. Their supply lines stretched thin, their flanks exposed. Manstein's SS Panzer Corps, 3 of the best divisions in the German army, struck these overextended Soviet formations from the south in mid-February, cutting through their supply lines, encircling and destroying several divisions, and retaking Kharkov by March 15. The Soviet forces in the area lost approximately 40,000 men killed and captured. It was impressive. It was also the last impressive thing the German army in the east would do offensively. The resources required for Manstein's operation had been scraped together from across Army Group South. There were no more such reserves. The German army was fighting, from this point forward, with its savings rather than its income. And the Soviets, whose income in men, tanks, aircraft, and artillery was now vastly greater than Germany's, would not make the same mistake again. Both sides looked at the Kursk salient and had similar thoughts. The German plan, Operation Citadel, called for attacking the base of the salient from both north and south, cutting it off and encircling the Soviet forces inside. It was the same encirclement formula that had worked so many times in 1941 and 1942. A successful citadel would destroy several Soviet armies, straighten the German line, and demonstrate that German offensive power remained intact. The Soviets knew about Citadel months before it launched, through multiple intelligence sources including the famous Lucy spy ring in Switzerland and agents within the German High Command. What they did with this intelligence was something new. Instead of attacking preemptively, they decided to let the Germans attack into a defensive system so elaborate that it would grind the offensive to a halt, and then counterattack into the weakened and exhausted German forces. The construction of that defensive system was one of the largest engineering projects of the war. Soviet engineers dug approximately 4,000 kilometers of trenches in the Kursk salient, enough placed end to end to stretch from Moscow to London. They planted nearly 1.3 million mines, approximately half anti-tank, half anti-personnel, at densities of up to 2,400 mines per kilometer of front in the areas the German armored thrusts were expected to hit. Anti-tank guns were positioned specifically for flanking fire at ranges of 200 to 400 meters, where they could engage German tanks from the sides, where the armor was thinner. Tank armies were held in reserve, positioned carefully behind the defensive belts, waiting to counterattack when the German advance had been stopped. The work was done by soldiers and by hundreds of thousands of civilian volunteers, women and elderly men from the surrounding towns and villages who dug in shifts alongside the military engineering units. They worked 18 hours a day. The ground was hard in the summer heat, and digging trenches by hand in hard ground is exhausting work, and they did it for weeks. The Germans attacked on July 5, 1943. The Tiger tank was the weapon on which the German commanders placed their greatest hope. The Panzerkampfwagen 6 Tiger I weighed 57 tons and was protected by 100 mm of frontal armor that the standard Soviet 76 mm tank gun could not penetrate at normal combat ranges. Its own weapon, the 88 mm KWK-36 gun derived from the famous anti-aircraft cannon, could destroy a T-34 at 1,800 meters. The asymmetry was extreme. A Tiger could kill a T-34 before the T-34 could even begin to threaten it. This asymmetry was real, and it generated a specific kind of dread among Soviet tank crews. An SS Panzer tank commander named Michael Wittmann, who would become the highest-scoring German tank commander of the war, described the Tiger's engagement at Kursk with the detached precision of a professional. Long-range engagements, systematic destruction of Soviet armor before it could close to effective range. His tank survived Kursk, and his crew's accounts described the T-34 crews attempting to close the range desperately, knowing that their only hope was to get inside the distance where the Tiger's armor was penetrable. But the Tiger was also slow, prone to mechanical breakdown, difficult to transport and maintain, and available in relatively small numbers. Perhaps 150 Tigers were committed to Citadel. The mass of German armor was still the Panzer IV and the new Panther, both of which had their own vulnerabilities. And the Soviet defensive system had been specifically designed to absorb this kind of attack. On the first day in the north, the German Ninth Army under Walter Model ran into the Soviet defenses and essentially stopped. The minefields were denser than anything his engineers had encountered. Pioneer units sent forward to clear paths were hit by artillery pre-sighted on the approaches. The anti-tank guns firing from the flanks took vehicles as they threaded through the cleared lanes. By the end of the first day, the Ninth Army had advanced a few kilometers and taken casualties it could not replace. In the south, the 4th Panzer Army under General Hermann Hoth, spearheaded by the SS Panzer Corps, did significantly better. The SS units Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf were the most capable fighting formations in the German military, and they drove through the first two Soviet defensive belts and reached the area of Prokhorovka by July 11, 30 kilometers into the Soviet defensive zone. At Prokhorovka on July 12, the largest tank battle in history took place. Soviet General Pavel Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army, approximately 800 tanks, attacked into the advancing SS Corps, approximately 600 tanks, in the early morning. The engagement that followed was not a neat tactical battle. It was a collision in poor visibility. Summer dust and smoke had reduced visibility to dozens of meters in some areas, between hundreds of tanks at ranges that sometimes fell to under 50 meters. Rotmistrov had made a specific decision to attack at close range. At long range, Soviet 76 mm guns could not penetrate Tiger frontal armor. At very close range, under 100 meters, sometimes far closer, they could. The cost of closing that range was the exposure of T-34s to Tiger fire during the approach. Soviet tank crews in that engagement were driving toward vehicles that were killing their comrades in front of them, knowing that their only alternative was to stop and die at distance. A radio operator in a T-34 regiment, whose account was published in a Soviet veterans anthology in the 1970s. We could not see anything. We drove in the direction the commander indicated and fired when he gave the order to fire. Sometimes there was an explosion, and we didn't know if we had hit or been hit until the tank kept moving. The driver was praying. I think we were all praying. I am not a religious man. I don't know who I was praying to. We drove until we couldn't, and then we got out if we could. At the end of July 12th, the SS Panzer Corps had not broken through. The Soviet losses were severe. Rotmistrov lost roughly 400 tanks, but the German losses were significant too, and more importantly, the German objective had not been achieved. The offensive in the north was already effectively stalled. On July 13th, citing the Allied landings in Sicily 2 days earlier, Hitler cancelled Operation Citadel. The cancellation was operationally defensible. The operation had failed on its own terms, and transferring forces to meet the new threat in the Mediterranean was a rational decision given the overall German strategic situation. But strategically, cancelling Citadel was the admission of something fundamental. The German army could no longer impose its will on the Eastern Front. From the summer of 1943 onward, the initiative belonged to the Soviet Union. The Germans would never launch another major strategic offensive in Russia. The Soviet response to Citadel's cancellation was Operations Kutuzov and Rumiantsev, counteroffensives that struck the German flanks north and south of the Kursk salient, attacking into German forces that had already been weakened by the attritional fighting of Citadel. Kutuzov, launched July 12th against the Oral salient north of Kursk, threatened to encircle German Ninth Army and forced a withdrawal. Rumiantsev, launched August 3rd against the Belgorod-Kharkov sector south of Kursk, drove 200 kilometers in 2 weeks and retook Kharkov for the final time on August 23, 1943. Kharkov had now changed hands 4 times in 2 years. The city's pre-war population of about 900,000 had been reduced to perhaps 190,000 by the time Soviet forces liberated it. German occupation policies, starvation of the civilian population, deportation of hundreds of thousands to forced labor in Germany, systematic killing of Jews and Communist Party members, had produced a city that was, in the words of the Soviet officers who occupied it in August 1943, barely alive. What had been one of the great industrial cities of the Soviet Union, with universities and theaters and museums and factories, was a shadow of itself. The liberation of Kharkov in August 1943 marked the effective end of large-scale German offensive capability on the Eastern Front. From this point onward, Germany would be fighting defensive actions, trying to preserve territory rather than seize it, trying to exhaust Soviet offensive momentum rather than generate its own. The initiative had shifted permanently. The question was no longer whether the Soviet Union would win, but how long it would take and what it would cost. The year 1943 was the year the Red Army won the sky. In June 1941, the Soviet Air Force had been destroyed in the first 10 days, 4,000 aircraft lost, the majority on the ground. What replaced them in the desperate months of 1941 were machines and pilots who were outmatched in almost every respect. The German fighter pilots had the accumulated experience of years of combat. Men like Erich Hartmann, who would end the war with 352 aerial victories, had been flying combat missions since before the Eastern Front opened. Soviet pilots died in enormous numbers not primarily because their aircraft were dramatically inferior. The Yak-1 and Lag-3 were not fundamentally worse than the Messerschmitt Bf-109, but because they lacked the training, the tactics, and the communication infrastructure to fight effectively. German pilots had radios that worked. Soviet pilots often did not. German fighter units had developed sophisticated pair and four-ship tactics. Soviet pilots were often still flying in rigid formations that date to the First World War. The survivors of this terrible school learned. A pilot who lived through the first year of the Eastern Front Air War had encountered almost everything the Germans could do to him and had found ways to survive it. Those men trained the pilots who replaced the ones who hadn't survived. The knowledge accumulated. The aircraft improved as well. The Lavochkin La-5, which entered service in 1942, was powered by an air-cooled radial engine that proved more reliable than the liquid-cooled engines in earlier Soviet fighters, and its performance at low altitude, where most Eastern Front air combat took place, was genuinely competitive with the Messerschmitt Bf 109G and Focke-Wulf 190. The La-7 that followed it was arguably superior at the altitudes where the fighting predominantly occurred. The Yak-9, which appeared in the autumn of 1942, was lighter and faster than its predecessors and became one of the most produced fighter aircraft of the war. But the air war was about more than individual aircraft. The Soviet Air Force reorganized. Air armies were attached directly to each front, providing coordinated support rather than the fragmented deployment of 1941 and 1942. The doctrine of air superiority first, clear the sky before attempting ground support, was implemented systematically. Ground attack units were trained specifically for the role rather than being sent to bomb targets with general-purpose aircraft by pilots who had no idea what they were doing. The Il-2 Sturmovik was the weapon that defined Soviet ground attack operations. Over 36,000 were built, more than any other aircraft in history. It was designed from the start as an armored flying machine. The engine and crew were protected by a steel shell that was part of the aircraft's structure rather than added armor plate. German soldiers who encountered it called it Schwarzer Tod, Black Death. Soviet soldiers called it the flying tank. Its 37mm cannon could pierce the roof armor of a German tank. Its rockets and bombs could destroy vehicles, trains, artillery positions, and supply depots with consistent reliability. Stalin, when production fell behind in 1941, sent a famous message to the factory directors. The Red Army needs the Il-2 the way it needs air, the way it needs bread. I demand more Il-2s. He got more Il-2s. Ivan Kozhedub arrived at a combat unit in March 1943 after spending most of the previous 2 years as a flight instructor, a role he hated and that probably saved his life during the deadliest phase of the air war. When he finally reached the 240th Fighter Aviation Regiment, flying La-5s, he was technically accomplished but had zero combat experience, and his first engagements were not particularly impressive. He nearly collided with a German aircraft in his first serious dogfight and came home with holes in his aircraft from his own gunfire bouncing off the canopy. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Nikolai Levin, told him he needed to learn before he tried to fight. Kozhedub listened. Within months he had found his understanding of aerial combat, that specific gift the Germans called Fingerspitzengefühl, fingertip feel, the ability to process speed and angle and distance faster than conscious thought. By the time Kursk was fought in July 1943, Kozhedub had become one of the most effective fighter pilots in the Soviet Air Force. By the end of the war, he had flown 330 combat missions and shot down 64 confirmed enemy aircraft, more than any other Allied pilot in any theater in any nation's air force. He received the Hero of the Soviet Union 3 times. He was 25 years old when the war ended. But the story of Soviet air power in this period is not only the story of male fighter pilots. The 588th Night Bomber Aviation Regiment, later redesignated the 46th Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment, was an all-female unit flying the Polikarpov P-2 biplane, a 1920s-era training aircraft with a top speed of 150 km per hour and a bomb load of 200 kilograms. It was, by any objective measure, an obsolete aircraft. The women who flew it made it something else. They flew exclusively at night, typically 8 to 15 sorties per crew per night. Their tactic was specific. Approach the target at altitude, cut the engine, and glide in silence over the target before releasing the bombs and restarting the engine to escape. The silence of the glide, the only sound a soft rushing of air through the biplane's wires, was how they earned their German name. Nachthexen, night witches. German soldiers described hearing nothing, then an explosion. No engine sound, no warning. A broom sound, they said, a rustling in the dark before destruction. The Soviet women adopted the name with pride and wore it openly. Nadezhda Popova flew 852 combat missions with the regiment. Irina Sabrova flew 1,008 more combat sorties than any other pilot of any gender in the Soviet Air Force. 23 members of the regiment received the Hero of the Soviet Union. The regiment flew approximately 23,000 sorties during the war and dropped approximately 3,000 tons of bombs. All of this was done in aircraft that a trained German pilot in a modern fighter could have destroyed easily, if he could find them in the dark, if he could match their low-altitude, low-speed maneuverability, and if they hadn't already dropped their bombs and disappeared. The regiment had been formed in late 1941 by Marina Reskova, the most celebrated Soviet female pilot of the pre-war period, who had set international distance records and who used her personal connection with Stalin to secure permission to form combat air units from female volunteers. Reskova did not live to see what her regiment became. She died in a crash in January 1943, flying in poor visibility during the relocation of her unit to a new base. She was given the first state funeral of World War II in the Soviet Union. The shift in air power over the Eastern Front was not sudden or total. The Luftwaffe continued to produce extraordinary individual pilots throughout the war, and German fighter units remained formidable opponents until the very end. But by 1944, the Soviet Air Force had effective control of the sky over most of the front, most of the time. The Stuka dive bombers that had been the Wehrmacht's close air support weapon since 1939, the aircraft that had made German armored advances so devastating, were now too slow and too vulnerable to operate without fighter escort that the Luftwaffe increasingly could not provide. German tank commanders who had always been able to call for air support now fought without it. Soviet tank commanders who had always feared it could now advance with something approaching impunity from the air. The Luftwaffe's decline was not simply a matter of aircraft or pilots. It was a matter of fuel. German synthetic fuel production, the coal liquefaction plants that had provided much of Germany's aviation fuel after Romania's oil fields began to be threatened, were bombed by the U.S. Army Air Forces from mid-1944 onward. Fuel shortages that had been manageable in 1943 became acute in 1944. German pilot training, which had always been thorough and extensive by the standards of the war, was cut dramatically as fuel was rationed. New pilots arrived at the front with fewer hours than their predecessors had had, against opponents who now had more. The cumulative result was a Luftwaffe that was shrinking on all dimensions simultaneously. Fewer aircraft, less fuel, less trained pilots, against a growing Soviet Air Force that had solved its early problems and was producing competent pilots in large numbers from training schools that Kozhedub himself had helped design. The production numbers tell the story with mechanical clarity. In 1941, the Soviet Union produced approximately 15,700 aircraft. Germany produced approximately 11,800. By 1944, Soviet production had reached approximately 40,300 aircraft annually. German production peaked at approximately 39,800. The Soviet advantage in numbers, combined with the fuel crisis affecting German operations, meant that by late 1944 the Luftwaffe could put into the air a fraction of the aircraft it had flown in 1941. The Soviet Air Force, which had been destroyed in June 1941, had become larger and more capable than the Luftwaffe that had destroyed it. The war in the sky had turned. So had the war on the ground. Between Kursk in the summer of 1943 and the end of that year, the Red Army became a fundamentally different military organization. The leadership change was the most important. The purges of 1937 to 38 had killed the generation of officers who had been trained on operational art, the theory of large-scale coordinated operations that could penetrate enemy defenses and destroy entire army groups rather than simply defeating individual units. The men who survived the purges and the catastrophes of 1941 and 1942 learned those lessons in the hardest possible school. By 1943, a generation of Soviet commanders had emerged who understood what Tukhachevsky had understood and who had the resources and the authority to implement it. Zhukov, Vasilevsky, Rokossovsky, Konyev, Chukov, Rotmistrov. These were men who had been trained under the Soviet system, who had survived the purges through a combination of ability and political caution, who had watched the disasters of 1941 and learned from them at a pace that cost millions of lives but produced something at the end of the learning. By 1943, they were commanding armies that they understood how to use. The doctrine they developed, deep battle operations, was in some respects the fulfillment of what Tukhachevsky had theorized. The idea was to attack simultaneously along multiple axes at great depth, destroying the enemy's ability to respond by striking not just the front line but the reserves behind it, the command infrastructure, the logistics nodes. An enemy being struck everywhere at once cannot reinforce any specific point. He either collapses or retreats. This required coordination between arms, between infantry, armor, artillery, engineers, and air power, on a scale and with a precision that the Red Army of 1941 could not have achieved. The radio equipment from Lend-Lease had solved a fundamental coordination problem. The training and doctrine developed through 1942 and 1943 had addressed the human and institutional problems. By 1944, the Soviet Army was implementing deep battle at the scale that Tukhachevsky had dreamed of, with the resources and leadership to make it work. Soviet soldiers called their artillery Bog Voyny, the god of war. They were not speaking rhetorically. By 1944, the Soviet Army deployed concentrations of artillery that had no parallel in military history. In major operations, they routinely massed 200 to 300 guns per kilometer of front, and in the most critical breakthrough sectors, densities far higher. The barrage that preceded a major Soviet offensive was not suppressive fire in the conventional sense. It was obliteration. German infantry who survived such barrages described hours of experience in which the ground itself seemed to have become hostile, in which all normal perception ceased and existence contracted to the effort of not dying in the next few seconds. Those who survived often emerged unable to fight coherently, stunned, disoriented, physically damaged by the concussive effects of hundreds of explosions in close proximity, even if no shell had directly hit them. The IS-2 heavy tank entered service in early 1944. Its 122 mm gun fired a projectile weighing 25 kilograms at a muzzle velocity sufficient to penetrate any German vehicle at combat ranges. When it hit a Tiger tank, the weapon Soviet tankers had feared most, the result was typically catastrophic. Turrets blown off, hulls split open, crews killed instantly or left with wounds that the tank's internal structure could not protect them from. The IS-2 had weaknesses: a slow rate of fire, with two-piece ammunition that required the loader to handle both propellant and projectile separately, but its firepower was decisive when it connected. The Guards designation rewarded excellence and created elite formations that received priority in equipment and resupply. Guards armies and Guards tank armies fought in the most important sectors and were the formations that foreign military observers, watching the Soviet offensives of 1944, found most impressive. The Guard system also motivated ordinary units. The prospect of earning the Guards designation was, according to the testimony of many veterans, a genuine incentive that drove unit performance in ways that purely punitive measures could not. The penal battalions, Strafbati, occupied the opposite end of the spectrum. Soldiers and officers convicted of crimes or military failures were assigned to these units and sent to the most dangerous sectors. Clearing minefields on foot, assault missions against fortified positions, tasks where the casualty rate was extreme and the chance of survival minimal. A man who survived 3 months in a Strafbat and was wounded was considered to have redeemed himself and was returned to a regular unit. Some sources estimate over 400,000 men served in Strafbati during the war. Their existence was a direct expression of the system's willingness to spend human lives in ways that an army with different values would not have countenanced. Their effectiveness as a military tool is difficult to separate from their effectiveness as a terror mechanism. By the end of 1943, the Red Army had everything it needed to win the war. It had the doctrine, the leadership, the equipment, and the industrial base. What remained was the work of doing it, which would cost, over the following 18 months, millions more lives. The transformation of the Red Army between 1941 and 1944 is one of the most dramatic institutional changes in military history. It was accomplished not through any single reform or any single brilliant decision, but through the accumulation of experience, the replacement of the men who had not learned with the men who had survived learning, and the gradual increase in the resources available to implement the lessons. The Red Army of 1944 was not a different army in any organizational sense from the Red Army of 1941. It used the same ranks, the same structure, the same basic doctrine at the level of the individual soldier. It was a different army in every meaningful way because the people in it had learned, in the most demanding possible school, what actually worked. Consider what Konstantin Rokossovsky had been through to become the kind of general he was in 1944. He had been arrested in 1937 on fabricated charges, imprisoned, tortured. His teeth were knocked out, several ribs broken, his fingernails pulled out, and sent to a labor camp. He was released in 1940, probably because the Soviet military urgently needed experienced commanders after the disastrous winter war against Finland had demonstrated how much damage the purges had done. He was reinstated in his rank, issued a new uniform, and told to report for duty. He went back to work. He commanded the 9th Mechanized Corps in the disaster of the first weeks of Barbarossa, then a series of higher commands through the terrible year of 1941, then the Don Front that accepted the surrender of Paulus at Stalingrad. By 1944, he commanded the First Byelorussian Front, one of the most powerful military formations in Soviet history. The journey from a labor camp to commanding an army group through the worst war in history, in 8 years, this is one of the defining individual trajectories of the Eastern Front. Alexander Vasilevsky was a different kind of man entirely. A former priest's son who had served as a staff officer in the Tsar's army, joined the Red Army in the Civil War, and risen through the staff system. He was methodical, quietly brilliant, the kind of man who could hold the overall architecture of an enormous military operation in his head and make adjustments across its full width without losing track of the individual pieces. As chief of the General Staff, he and Zhukov were the primary architects of the Soviet military's greatest operations, Uranus, Bagration, the Berlin Offensive. Vasilevsky spent much of his time at the front rather than in Moscow, coordinating directly with front commanders in a way that kept the General Staff connected to the reality on the ground. He and Zhukov did not always agree, and when they disagreed, their arguments took place in a system where Stalin's word was final and disagreeing with Stalin was dangerous. Both survived. Both were right more often than wrong. This generation of commanders, forged in the purges, tested in the catastrophes of 1941, rebuilt in the bitter school of Stalingrad and Kursk, was, by 1944, probably the most capable body of military leadership the Soviet Union had ever produced, and arguably among the most capable in the world. What they were about to do with a completely reconstituted and re-equipped army would demonstrate this beyond any reasonable argument. On June 23, 1944, exactly 3 years and 1 day after Barbarossa, the Red Army launched the largest single military operation in the history of warfare. Operation Bagration targeted Army Group Center, the same Army Group Center that had driven on Moscow in 1941, that had been rebuilt and reconstituted multiple times over 3 years. The Germans anticipated a Soviet summer offensive, but their intelligence assessed it would fall in Ukraine, where the front favored mobile operations and where Soviet forces had already demonstrated offensive capability in previous seasons. Their strategic reserves were positioned in the south accordingly. Army Group Center, stripped of mobile reserves and extended across a vast front, received less attention than it should have. The deception operation Maskirovka that preceded Bagration was a masterpiece. Soviet forces assembled 4 fronts, 2.4 million soldiers, for the offensive, and the Germans largely failed to detect the buildup. Entire formations moved only at night. Radio traffic was carefully managed, minimized in the actual concentration area, artificially maintained at normal levels in other sectors to suggest normal activity. Fake army groups were suggested through dummy radio networks. Aircraft were forbidden from flying over the staging areas for weeks before the offensive. Soviet air superiority had reached the point where German aerial reconnaissance could be consistently denied. The artillery barrage that opened on June 23 was, by this point in the war, standard Soviet procedure, and it was still terrifying to anyone inside it. Over 31,000 guns and mortars fired simultaneously along a front more than 400 kilometers wide. German survivors described the ground shaking in a way that was physically distinct from anything they had previously experienced. Not the localized shaking of nearby explosions, but a continuous vibration in the earth itself, as if the ground were trying to throw off the weight of what was being done to it. When the assault forces moved forward, the German defenses ruptured in multiple places on the first day. The Soviet attack was not simply a breakthrough attempt at 1 or 2 points. It struck simultaneously across the entire front, preventing the Germans from identifying which penetration was the main effort and concentrating reserves against it. German divisions that tried to move to plug gaps found the roads cratered, their radio communications jammed, the movement corridors already under fire from Soviet aircraft that now owned the sky over the battle area. By the 4th day, multiple German formations had been bypassed and were being encircled. The 4th Army, the entire German 4th Army, was caught in a developing cauldron east of Minsk. Corps and divisions that had been ordered to hold their positions now found Soviet armor driving around them, cutting their supply lines, and threatening the roads they would need to retreat. German commanders radioed increasingly desperate situation reports to Army Group Center headquarters, which could do nothing. Army Group Center's mobile reserves had been stripped to reinforce other fronts, and the reserves it had retained were being destroyed faster than they could be reconstituted. The fall of Minsk, the Belarusian capital, On July 3rd was the symbolic marker of the operation's scale. Minsk had been occupied by Germany since the first week of the invasion, nearly 3 years. Its liberation put Soviet forces roughly where they had been in June 1941, at the approximate starting line of Barbarossa. From that starting line, they would advance to Berlin. The speed of the advance was, again, remarkable, 25 to 30 kilometers per day, sustained over weeks. German units that had been bypassed and left in the forests of Belorussia tried to move west in groups, fighting partisan units and Soviet rear area security forces, trying to reach German lines that were moving away from them faster than they could march. Some eventually broke through. Most were killed or captured. On July 17, 1944, 57,600 German prisoners of war, a number specifically chosen to be simultaneously impressive and manageable, were marched through the streets of Moscow in a parade organized by Stalin for maximum effect. Soviet soldiers with brooms walked ahead of the column, symbolically sweeping the streets. The German prisoners, mostly generals and senior officers at the front, regular soldiers behind, marched for several kilometers through the city while Moscow crowds watched largely in silence. Some threw food at the prisoners, others threw garbage. Most simply watched. Moscow housewives later described the experience as strange. The Germans looked smaller than they had expected, thinner, more ordinary, not like the terrifying force that had reached the outskirts of this city 3 years earlier. Trucks with water cannons followed the column to clean the streets of whatever the prisoners left behind. By August 1944, Soviet forces had reached the Vistula River in Poland and the border of East Prussia, German territory, for the first time. The psychological significance cannot be overstated. For 3 years, Soviet soldiers had fought and died on Soviet soil. Now they were on the soil of the country whose army had invaded their homes. The implications were clear to everyone. Operation Bagration cost Germany, by most estimates, over 400,000 men killed, wounded, and captured, compared to roughly 60,000 Allied casualties in the Normandy landings during the same period. It destroyed 17 German divisions completely and severely damaged 50 more. Army Group Center, which had been one of the 3 great instruments of Barbarossa, was gone as a coherent fighting force. The operation receives, in Western historical accounts, a fraction of the attention given to Normandy. This is understandable in one sense. Normandy was where Western soldiers fought, and the Western world has naturally focused on stories that include itself. But the comparison in purely military terms is almost absurd. Bagration was the largest land operation in human history. It deserves more than a footnote after the Normandy chapter. What the liberated cities of Belorussia looked like in the summer of 1944 is worth noting, because it explains something about the psychological state of the soldiers who had fought through them. Minsk had been occupied for nearly 3 years. Its Jewish community, approximately 80,000 people before the war, had been almost entirely murdered by the time Soviet forces arrived. Shot in the Minsk ghetto, gassed at the Mali-Trosnitz extermination site outside the city, killed in a dozen other operations over 3 years of German occupation. Of the pre-war Jewish population of Minsk, perhaps 13,000 survived, nearly all of them in the forests with partisan groups. Soviet soldiers who had known Minsk before the war returned to a city where the streets were the same, but the people who had walked them were largely gone. The partisans who emerged from the forests when Soviet forces arrived were a specific phenomenon of the Eastern Front. Tens of thousands of fighters who had been living in the forests of Belorussia, Ukraine, and Russia for months or years, fighting behind German lines, conducting sabotage operations, protecting Jewish and other refugees, and maintaining a connection to the Soviet state under conditions that were almost incomprehensible in their difficulty. The Belarusian partisan movement alone, at its peak, involved over 370,000 people. Some partisan bands were well organized and effectively commanded. Others had developed their own rules in the forest that were difficult to reconcile with military law or civilian ethics. The process of reintegrating them into the regular army and society was not without friction. And after the liberation, after the parade of German prisoners through Moscow streets, there was the specific knowledge among Soviet soldiers that they were now going to cross into the country that had done all of this. That the men who had shot the Jews of Minsk, who had burned the villages of Belorussia, who had starved the prisoners of war in the open-air camps, those men's homes and families lay ahead. What the soldiers carried into Germany was not simply exhaustion and weapons. It was something heavier, and it would have consequences. As Soviet forces recaptured the territories that Germany had occupied since 1941, they confronted evidence of what the occupation had been that changed the men who saw it. The occupied territories of the Soviet Union, Belorussia, Ukraine, the Baltic states, the areas of Russia that had been held by Germany for months or years, had experienced an occupation whose character went beyond military administration. The Germans had come with a program. They had implemented it systematically. They had had 3 years. What Soviet soldiers found as they advanced through recaptured territory was visible from the surface. Mounds of earth that had settled unevenly, in patterns that experienced soldiers recognized immediately. The pits outside villages where the Jews had been shot. The sites outside towns where Soviet prisoners of war had been allowed to die. The remains of partisan executions in the village squares, where the Germans had hanged men from the same trees that were now budding in the summer sun. Soldiers who came from these communities, Jewish soldiers searching for families, Ukrainian soldiers returning to villages, Belarusian soldiers walking through what had been their hometowns, confronted specific personal losses against the backdrop of general devastation. Vasily Grossman reached the Treblinka extermination camp in September 1944, shortly after Soviet forces secured the area. The Germans had attempted to destroy the evidence, dismantling the gas chambers, plowing the grounds, planting trees over the mass graves. What they could not destroy was the evidence of scale. The indentations where the graves had been, the personal effects that had been scattered through the surrounding woods and that no amount of covering over could fully conceal, the testimony of the surviving population of the nearby town of Treblinka. Grossman interviewed everyone he could find. He walked the grounds. He wrote everything down. His piece, The Hell of Treblinka, published in the Soviet newspaper Znamya in November 1944, was one of the first detailed accounts of a German extermination camp published anywhere in the world. He described the evidence methodically, the ground that sank where the graves were, the hair visible in the disturbed earth, the children's clothing in the woods, the specific and terrible arithmetic of what the survivors could tell him about daily operations. He estimated that between 700,000 and 800,000 people had been killed at Treblinka. The current historical estimate is approximately 700,000 to 900,000, the overwhelming majority of them Jews. I stood in this place, he wrote, and I understood that the word Treblinka will remain forever among the most terrible words in the history of humanity. I understood this clearly, and I wanted to write about it as clearly as I could, so that those who read it would also understand what this word means. He had been to Stalingrad. He had been to the occupied territories. He had found his mother's fate in Berdichev, where the Jews of the city had been shot in mass graves in September 1941. At Treblinka, all of it came together. The specific industrial quality of the killing, carried out with German thoroughness and Soviet victims, in a location that was simultaneously one specific place in northern Poland and a statement about what the war had been fought over. Life and Fate, the novel he had been composing mentally through all of it, would eventually compare the Soviet and German systems of totalitarianism as twin expressions of the same impulse to subordinate individual human lives to ideological abstraction. That comparison would eventually get the book seized by the KGB and keep it from publication for nearly 2 decades after his death. The soldiers who read Grossman's dispatches, who liberated the villages and found the pits, who walked through the ruins of communities they had grown up in, they carried what they found with them as they continued west. Some of what they carried expressed itself in ways that do not belong in any simple moral category, and that the full history of the war cannot omit. There was a nurse named Zina Tusnolobova who belongs in any account of what the Red Army was and what it cost. She was 22 years old, serving in the 625th Infantry Regiment, when she went out under fire in February 1943 near Gomel in Belarus to reach a wounded soldier. She was hit by machine gun fire that shattered both her arms and both her legs. She lay in the snow for over 18 hours before she was found. Both arms were amputated below the elbow. Both legs were amputated below the knee. From her hospital bed, she dictated letters to the front that were published in Soviet newspapers. "My comrades," she wrote, in a letter addressed to the soldiers of her regiment. "What I want to tell you is very simple. I believed in you before. Now I know you. Go forward. Kill. Take back what was ours. I will be with you, even if I cannot walk." The letters circulated through units across the Red Army. Political officers read them aloud before engagements. The story of Zina Tusnolobova, the nurse who had done what nurses were supposed to do and paid for it with her limbs, became one of the facts that soldiers carried with them, one of the specific weights in the accumulated burden of what the war had cost and what it was being fought for. She survived. She was fitted with prosthetic limbs and learned to use them. She married, had children, worked as an activist for veterans' rights, and lived until 1980. She was made hero of the Soviet Union. The letter she had dictated from the hospital, thin, handwritten by someone else's hand, her voice in another person's script, went to Germany with the soldiers who read it, a statement about what had been done and what would be answered for. High above the steppe where the ground war was transforming, the air war was transforming equally. In 1941, Soviet pilots had been so badly outmatched by the Luftwaffe that ramming, the deliberate collision with enemy aircraft, hoping to survive when the German pilot did not, had been a recognized, if unofficial, tactic. Soviet pilots who ran out of ammunition, or whose guns jammed, who were alongside a German bomber and had no other option, sometimes rammed. The Taran, as it was called, was not suicide exactly, since some pilots survived. But it was an act of last resort that speaks to the desperation of the early air war, when Soviet aircraft and training and tactics were simply not adequate to meet the Luftwaffe on equal terms. By 1943, this had changed not entirely and not evenly but fundamentally. The aircraft were better. The Lavochkin La-5FN and the Yakovlev Yak-9, produced in the factories that had been relocated east of the Urals, were genuinely capable fighters, not superior to the German Mi-109G in every dimension, but fast enough and maneuverable enough to compete on equal terms when flown by pilots who knew what they were doing. And the pilots, after 2 years of a war that killed the incompetent rapidly and taught the survivors quickly, were increasingly men who knew exactly what they were doing. Ivan Kozhedub was born in 1920 in a small village in the Sumy Oblast of Ukraine, the son of a peasant farmer. He learned to fly in an aero club in the late 1930s, and by the time he joined the Soviet Air Force and passed through its accelerated wartime training, he was technically proficient. But the first 40-odd missions he flew in 1943 produced no aerial victories and one near disaster when his aircraft was damaged by German fire and he barely made it back to base. He was not immediately a natural combat pilot. He became one. What changed was partly tactical education from more experienced pilots in his regiment, partly accumulated experience in the specific conditions of the Eastern Front Air War, partly the La-5FN he began flying in mid-1943, which was faster at low altitude than anything the Luftwaffe had in the same class. He opened his aerial account on July 6, 1943, during the Kursk battle, shooting down a Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber. He did not stop for 2 years. By the end of the war, Ivan Kozhedub had flown 330 combat sorties and shot down 64 enemy aircraft, the highest confirmed total of any Allied pilot in the entire war. He was the most successful fighter ace on the Allied side, a fact that receives considerably less attention in Western histories than the comparable German aces of the period, or the RAF aces of the Battle of Britain. He was never shot down. He was awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union 3 times, the only pilot in Soviet history to receive the award 3 times. After the war he commanded air armies, rose to Marshal of Aviation, and lived until 1991, dying, like Zaitsev, in the year the system that made him a hero ceased to exist. The Air War's transformation over the Eastern Front between 1942 and 1944 was not simply a matter of better aircraft and better pilots. It was a change in how the air forces were organized and used. The Soviet air armies, reorganized in 1942 on the model of the German Luftflotten, were concentrated at points of main effort rather than dispersed across the entire front. The result was local air superiority at the critical moment and place. The same principle that the Germans had applied in 1941 and 1942 to devastating effect, now being applied by an adversary who had learned the lesson under the most painful possible teaching conditions. The Luftwaffe, which had been stretched to cover multiple fronts, North Africa, the Mediterranean, increasingly the defense of Germany itself against Allied strategic bombing, could not match these concentrations. The mathematics of the air war shifted, and by 1944 Soviet pilots were flying over territory that Soviet ground forces controlled, rather than fighting desperately to contest skies that the Germans had already largely won. On August 1, 1944, the Home Army of Poland, the Armia Krajowa, launched an uprising in Warsaw. The AK, approximately 50,000 fighters in and around the city, was the military arm of the Polish government in exile in London. Its commander, General Tadeusz Borkomarovsky, had been planning the uprising for months, waiting for the moment when German forces would be sufficiently weakened and Soviet forces sufficiently close. That moment appeared to have arrived in late July 1944, when the Soviet advance under Rokossovsky approached the eastern bank of the Vistula and the sounds of Soviet artillery could be heard from the rooftops of Warsaw. Borkomarovsky's calculation was political as much as military. A Warsaw liberated by Polish hands, by the Home Army, loyal to the London government rather than to the Soviet-backed Lublin Committee, would be a powerful argument for the London Poles' claim to represent Poland's legitimate government in the negotiations that would determine the country's post-war fate. Stalin had made no secret of his preference for the Lublin Committee, his own creation. Borkomarovsky intended to confront Soviet forces with a fact on the ground. The uprising began at 5 p.m. on August 1st. In the first hours, the AK seized significant portions of central Warsaw, catching the German garrison off guard. Street fighting erupted throughout the city. The uprising's initial success was remarkable. The Germans were taken by surprise. AK fighters who had been hiding weapons for years emerged in civilian clothes and quickly transformed into organized military units. The German response was swift and without restraint. Heinrich Himmler ordered the use of extreme violence, specifically authorizing the SS units sent to crush the uprising to kill without distinction between combatants and civilians. The units he sent were chosen for this purpose. The Dirlewanger Brigade, a penal unit composed of convicted criminals, led by Oskar Dirlewanger, a man with a documented record of atrocities in Yugoslavia and Belarus, and the Kaminsky Brigade, composed of Soviet collaborators under Bronislaw Kaminsky who had participated in anti-partisan operations of exceptional brutality. What these units did in the Wala district of Warsaw on August 5th and 6th, 1944 was among the worst single atrocities of the war. In 2 days, approximately 40,000 to 50,000 civilians were killed. Men, women, and children, in their homes, in the streets, in the hospitals where they were receiving treatment. Medical personnel were shot alongside patients. Priests were shot on the steps of churches. The elderly and very young were killed alongside those of military age. German engineers later estimated that approximately 10,000 people per day died in Wala during those 2 days, a killing rate that required systematic organization, not simply the chaos of combat. Even by the standards of the SS, this was noticed. General Erich von dem Boxeluski, who commanded the overall German suppression operation, later testified that the Kaminsky Brigade's conduct went beyond what he considered acceptable, which is a statement that takes some consideration to fully absorb, coming from a man who commanded SS anti-partisan operations. He had Kaminsky shot, officially for looting. The actual reason was that Kaminsky's behavior was becoming an embarrassment even within the SS command structure. The Dirlewanger Brigade continued its operations. As the German grip on the streets tightened, the AK and surviving civilians retreated into the only space the Germans could not easily follow, the sewer network of Warsaw. The sewers became an underground city. People lived in them, moved through them, maintained communications through them. Children became runners, memorizing routes between sections of the network, delivering messages and food in the dark. Doctors established aid stations in the sewers. A postal system operated using sewer routes. Above, the Germans were methodically destroying Warsaw building by building. Below, Warsaw was still functioning after a fashion. The question of why Soviet forces did not cross the Vistula to support the uprising is one that historians have argued about ever since, and the argument has not been fully resolved because it probably requires assigning definite weight to two factors that were both real. The military factor. Rokossovsky's First Byelorussian Front had been advancing for over a month at extreme pace and was genuinely exhausted. The German resistance on the eastern bank of the Vistula was significantly stiffer than expected. Soviet supply lines were overextended after the enormous advance of Bagration. The political factor. Stalin had obvious reasons for allowing the London Poles to be destroyed by the Germans, leaving the Lublin Committee as the only functioning Polish political authority. He specifically described the AK fighters as criminals and adventurists in communications with the Western Allies, denying them the legitimacy that would have justified Soviet military assistance. Britain and the United States requested permission to fly supply missions to Warsaw and land at Soviet airfields to refuel. The distance from Ally-controlled airfields in Italy made refueling necessary. Stalin refused. He refused for weeks, until September. by which time the strategic situation in Warsaw had deteriorated beyond any realistic hope of rescue. Without Lend-Lease, without Allied drop supplies, the uprising continued on what the AK could find in the city, which was increasingly nothing. The uprising lasted 63 days. On October 2, 1944, Borko-Moravsky surrendered. His fighters were granted prisoner of war status, better than many had expected. The surviving civilian population was expelled from the city. German engineering units spent the following months carrying out Hitler's explicit order. Warsaw was to be demolished. They used architectural surveys to identify historically significant buildings and destroyed those first. By the time Soviet forces crossed the Vistula in January 1945, Warsaw was, in the assessment of Soviet engineers who surveyed it, approximately 85% destroyed. Grossman, who entered Warsaw with the advancing Soviet forces, wrote, "Warsaw does not exist. This is a philosophical statement, not a military one. The city that was Warsaw has been made into a message. The message is, we did this. Do not forget who did this." He was right about the message. The Polish people rebuilt Warsaw in the years after the war, rebuilt it building by building from historical photographs and architectural records, an act of collective will and collective defiance that remains one of the more remarkable achievements of the post-war period. But the Warsaw of 1944 was gone, and the people who died there were not rebuilt. The Warsaw Uprising sits in a specific position in the historical memory of the war, and its specific position tells you something about how nations process catastrophe. In Poland, the uprising is remembered with enormous reverence, as a heroic attempt, as evidence of the Polish national will to resist, as a tragedy. In Russia, for many decades, it was barely acknowledged an adventure, as Stalin had called it, an act of anti-Soviet politics rather than anti-German resistance. In Britain and America, the refusal to allow supply aircraft to land at Soviet airfields, which effectively condemned the uprising to failure, was discussed primarily in the context of Allied frustration with Stalin's intransigence, not in the context of the Polish people who died as a consequence. The AK soldiers who survived the uprising were treated differently depending on their fate. Those who surrendered to the Germans were, as Borko-Moravsky had negotiated, given prisoner of war status and sent to German camps from which many survived. Those who fell into Soviet hands were treated as what Stalin had called them, enemies. Some were sent to Soviet labor camps. Some were simply killed. The Polish underground army that had fought the German occupation for 5 years, that had organized intelligence networks and resistance cells and had launched one of the largest urban uprisings of the war, was destroyed as an effective force in the autumn of 1944, partly by the Germans who crushed the uprising, and partly by the Soviets who ensured it had no future. Poland emerged from the war having lost approximately 6 million people, 17% of its pre-war population, the highest proportional death toll of any country in the conflict. It emerged also with changed borders, shifted westward to absorb German territory while losing eastern regions to the Soviet Union, and with a Soviet-backed government that would rule it for the next 45 years. The AK veterans who survived lived under a government that regarded them as enemies. The uprising they had fought was not officially commemorated until after 1989, when the communist government fell and Poland could finally tell its own story. By January 1945, the military situation in Germany was beyond recovery. The Vistula offensive, which began on January 12, advanced Soviet forces 500 kilometers in 3 weeks, an average of 25 kilometers per day, the fastest sustained advance of any army in the war. The first Belarusian and first Ukrainian fronts drove through Poland and into Germany, reaching the Oder River 70 kilometers from Berlin by February. The Germans had almost nothing to stop them. Reserves that had been stripped from the east to meet the Allied threat in the west, formations that had been destroyed in the various encirclements of 1944, units that existed on paper but had been reduced to fragments. Army Group Vistula, nominally commanded by Himmler in one of Hitler's more bizarre personnel decisions, attempted to mount counterattacks from Pomerania into the flank of the Soviet advance. They failed or barely got started before being overwhelmed. By March, Pomerania was in Soviet hands and Army Group Vistula had ceased to exist as a coherent force. What it felt like to enter Germany as a Soviet soldier in January and February 1945 is preserved in memoirs and letters and diaries. a specific literature of crossing that differs fundamentally from the literature of the earlier years of the war. The retreats of 1941, the desperate urban fighting of Stalingrad, the grinding offensives of 1943 and 1944, had produced writing characterized by exhaustion and determination and grief. The writing from the crossing into Germany has a different quality. Something harder, something colder, something that is not quite rage but is related to it. The East Prussian city of Königsberg, an ancient Prussian fortress city, the city of Kant, heavily fortified by the Germans in the expectation of exactly this invasion, was surrounded by Soviet forces in late January 1945. The siege would last until April, but the territory around it was overrun, and the German civilian population of East Prussia, who had heard what Goebbels' propaganda told them about Soviet soldiers and who had experienced or heard about the events at Nemmersdorf in October 1944, fled in conditions of extraordinary desperation. The winter of 1944-45 was harsh, and the roads westward across East Prussia were clogged with civilians trying to reach the coast and evacuate by sea. German naval vessels attempted to evacuate civilians from the Baltic ports. Soviet submarines attacked the evacuation convoys. The sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff on January 30, 1945, struck by a Soviet submarine, killing approximately 9,000 people, primarily civilians, was the largest single loss of life in a maritime disaster in history, and it is largely unknown outside Germany. What Soviet soldiers did in East Prussia, to German civilians, to German villages, to German women in particular, is a history that cannot be simplified or avoided. Violence against German civilians was widespread, much of it sexual violence against women, well documented in Soviet military records, in German survivor testimony, and in later historical scholarship. It was committed by a significant portion of Soviet soldiers, not all of them. The factors that produced it were multiple. For years of accumulated anger at what Germany had done to Soviet lands and Soviet people. Official propaganda that had encouraged hatred of Germans as a category. Alcohol, often seized from German stocks. The absence of effective command discipline in some sectors, and the specific dynamic of men who had survived a war that had taught them to regard the lives of enemies as of minimal account. Soviet commanders who attempted to restrain it. Rokossovsky issued explicit orders. Other commanders tried to enforce them, met with limited success in the first weeks of the advance into Germany. The NKVD prosecuted cases when they came to official attention. Some soldiers were shot for crimes against civilians. But the scale of what occurred in East Prussia and later in other parts of Germany was too large for prosecution to address except selectively. It remained, for decades, a subject that neither Soviet nor German authorities discussed publicly with full honesty. The Germans, because of the obvious asymmetry, they had started the war. What happened to German civilians was not comparable to what Germany had done in the East. The Soviets, because honest discussion of their army's behavior contradicted the official narrative of the Great Patriotic War. The race for Berlin, though that framing simplifies something more complex, was partly a competition between Zhukov's First Belarusian Front and Konyev's First Ukrainian Front. Stalin had drawn the boundary between their sectors in a way that made it technically ambiguous which of them had authority to take the city, guaranteeing that both would advance with maximum speed and energy. For men who had fought since 1941, who had retreated from the Bug River to Moscow and then marched back across 4 years and 4,000 kilometers of destroyed landscape, the prospect of Berlin was something specific and heavy, not simply a military objective, something that had been earned in a way that defies any straightforward accounting. The Seelow Heights, the main German defensive position on the Oder, was where Zhukov faced his most serious obstacle in the final campaign. He attacked on April 16, 1945 with a barrage of 9,000 guns and then, in a decision that has been criticized by military historians ever since, with searchlights positioned behind his own lines to illuminate the German positions. The searchlights reflected off the morning haze and blinded his own tank crews instead, creating confusion in an attack that had already been planned for maximum speed. Zhukov, characteristically, responded to the initial difficulties by committing his tank armies before the breakthrough they were supposed to exploit had been achieved, creating massive traffic jams on the Seelow roads. The Seelow Heights fell on April 19, after 4 days of fighting that cost approximately 30,000 Soviet soldiers. Inside Berlin, the defenders consisted of regular Wehrmacht and SS units, Waffen-SS foreign volunteers, including Latvian, Estonian, and French SS formations whose members had committed themselves to the German cause and now had no exit, and the Volkssturm, the militia of men too old, too young, or too physically unfit for regular military service. Boys of 14 and 15 carrying Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons. Old men in whatever uniforms they had. Some fought with conviction. Others had been placed in front of execution squads by SS security units and had no choice. The Reichstag was defended by SS troops and Latvian volunteers. The battle for it lasted 2 days. Soviet assault groups cleared it floor by floor, room by room, finding defenders in basements and stairwells who fought without obvious hope or obvious intention to surrender. The noise in the building, grenades in confined spaces, submachine guns in corridors, was nearly beyond human tolerance. Soviet soldiers who fought through the Reichstag described the experience as lasting much longer than the hours it actually took, time having compressed and stretched in the way it does for people in extreme situations. In the bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, 50 meters below the street, Hitler had spent the final weeks issuing orders to armies that no longer existed, promoting officers to commands there were no troops to fill, dismissing commanders who tried to tell him the truth. His secretary, Traudl Junge, later described those days with the specific quality of memory that comes from having been present for something beyond ordinary experience. The unreality of it, the distance between the events above and the strange enclosed atmosphere below, the way the man who had started the war had become by its end a physically deteriorated figure whose hands shook and who seemed genuinely disconnected from the reality his decisions had created. Hitler married Eva Braun on April 29, 1945. He dictated his final political testament, blaming the Jews and the German people for losing the war he had started. On the afternoon of April 30th, he shot himself. Eva Braun took cyanide at the same moment. Their bodies were burned in the garden above the bunker, in accordance with Hitler's instructions, as Soviet forces fought in the streets a kilometer away. Sergeant Vladimir Kantaria and Sergeant Mikhail Yegorov raised the Soviet flag on the roof of the Reichstag at approximately 10:50 p.m. on April 30, 1945, though the precise time remains disputed. Kantaria was from Georgia. Yegorov was from Smolensk. They had reached the roof through a building that was still partly defended, fighting their way up stairwells and across corridors. The famous photograph, taken 2 days later by Yevgeny Kaldiai, staged for the camera but truthful in its essential meaning, shows a Soviet soldier raising the red flag over a destroyed city, smoke rising behind him in the morning light. It became one of the iconic images of the 20th century. Germany signed the unconditional surrender on May 8, 1945. The fighting in Berlin itself, from the first crossing of the Oder on April 16 to the final surrender of the Berlin garrison on May 2, cost the Soviet Union approximately 80,000 soldiers killed. This number shocked even commanders who had grown accustomed to high losses. For comparison, the entire D-Day invasion on June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious landing in history, cost the Allied forces approximately 10,000 casualties. The Soviet cost of taking Berlin alone was 8 times the Allied cost of the Normandy landings, in 16 days of fighting. Whether the costs could have been reduced, whether a different approach to the Silo Heights, a different coordination between Zhukov and Konyev, different tactics in the street fighting, is a question that military historians have analyzed at length. The answer, broadly, is yes. The Soviet High Command made costly mistakes in the Berlin operation. But the broader context is that the Soviet Union had been fighting for 4 years, had lost 27 million people, and was fighting the final battle of the most destructive war in history. The cost of the final battle was terrible. It was also, in the logic of the war as a whole, consistent with everything that had come before. General Helmuth Weidling, the German commander of the Berlin garrison, surrendered on May 2. He was taken to Soviet headquarters where he met General Vasily Zhukov, the same Zhukov who had commanded the defense of Stalingrad 2.5 years earlier. The encounter was recorded by Soviet officers present. Zhukov, who spoke little German, and Weidling, who spoke no Russian, communicated through interpreters. The conversation was brief and formal. Zhukov was polite. Weidling was exhausted. The men who had fought in Stalingrad and the men who had fought in Berlin were the same men. Some literally the same individual people, others the same armies. The arc from that riverside bunker in September 1942 to this meeting in a Berlin suburb in May 1945 represents one of the most extraordinary military reverses in history. In Moscow, when the news reached the city, hundreds of thousands of people poured into the streets. The celebrations lasted for days. People who had lost everything. Their homes, their families, their health, their years, celebrated with genuine and uncomplicated joy, because the thing that had caused the loss was over. It was over. The guns were quiet. People who had not slept without fear in 4 years lay down that night in the knowledge that they would wake up the next morning and the war would still be over. That was not a small thing. That was not a thing easily explained to anyone who had not spent 4 years in the position of not knowing whether civilization would survive until morning. Grossman was in Berlin when it ended. He wrote in his notebook on May 3, 1945, "It is finished. The guns are quiet. I walked through Berlin today. I have been here for 2 weeks, following the battle from building to building, and I have never seen it in anything like peace before. What I see is a ruined city. Miles of ruined city. Walls standing without buildings behind them like stage sets for a play that has closed. The smell is still smoke and something chemical that I cannot identify. In the rubble there are German soldiers, dead, in positions they died in days ago, that no one has yet moved because the fighting only stopped today. And there are Soviet soldiers, alive, some of them singing, some of them simply standing still with expressions I find difficult to describe. One man I spoke to had been a soldier since October 1941. He had started in Odessa. He was in Berlin. I asked him what he thought about. He said, "I think about going home." I said, "Where is home?" He said the name of a village in Smolensk Oblast that I knew. I had been there in the winter of 1941 when it was burning. I said nothing about that. He said, "I don't know if it's still there." I said I didn't know either. He nodded and walked away into the ruins. Grossman's notebook entries from Berlin were not published in his lifetime. They were published only after the fall of the Soviet Union, as part of the broader opening of archives that had been sealed for decades. The full accounting of what the war had been, the failures of 1941, the crimes of both sides, the moral complexity of an army fighting for a government that was itself criminal. This accounting had to wait for the political conditions that would allow it. Those conditions took nearly half a century to arrive. The numbers, even now, are almost impossible to absorb. 27 million Soviet citizens died between June 22, 1941, and May 9, 1945. Breaking this down by category does not make it more comprehensible, but it makes it more specific, which is at least closer to honest. Soviet military deaths. Approximately 8.7 million, by the most recent Russian estimates, though earlier Soviet figures put it higher and some historians believe the actual number exceeded 11 million, accounting for deaths in captivity and in the rear from wounds. Civilian deaths from direct German violence. Approximately 7 to 8 million. Siege deaths, Leningrad, Odessa, Sevastopol, and others, approximately 1 to 1.5 million. POW deaths in German captivity. Approximately 3.3 million. Jewish and Roma victims within Soviet borders. Approximately 1 to 1.5 million. The remainder, displacement, disease, famine directly caused by the war's disruption of agriculture and civil infrastructure. To these 27 million must be added the wounded. Approximately 18 million Soviet soldiers were wounded over the course of the war. Roughly 5 million suffered permanent disability. The Soviet military medical system, overwhelmed from the first hours of the invasion and operating often under fire, managed to return approximately 70% of wounded soldiers to duty, an achievement that was itself a factor in the Soviet Union's ability to maintain its army in the field through 4 years of catastrophic losses. The demographic consequences were visible in every Soviet census for decades afterward. The Soviet Union lost approximately 1 man for every 5 men between the ages of 18 and 45. In some villages in the central Russian oblasts, in Pskov, in Novgorod, in Smolensk, the 1946 census showed sex ratios of 2 or 3 women for every surviving man of fighting age. Women who had expected to marry and raise families returned from the factories and fields and hospitals to find the men simply gone. They built lives without them because there was no alternative, and the Soviet Union they built was shaped in ways both visible and invisible by the absence of the men who should have been there. The cultural consequences are harder to measure but equally real. The generation of Soviet writers, artists, scientists, and scholars who would have been born in the 1920s and come of age in the 1940s and 1950s, a generation that should have been the most educated and capable in Soviet history, the beneficiaries of the enormous investment in schools and universities that the Soviet state had made in the 1930s, this generation was largely destroyed by the war. The men who would have written the novels, built the institutions, founded the scientific schools, trained the next generation, they were in the mass graves outside Minsk and Kyiv and Stalingrad. What the Soviet Union lost culturally and intellectually in those mass graves is genuinely incalculable, and the loss was felt in every subsequent decade as a kind of absence that could not quite be named. The physical rebuilding was, by contrast, extraordinary in its speed and scale. The Soviet Union repaired and rebuilt its war damage faster than anyone expected, faster than Western analysts predicted, using a combination of centralized state planning, German prisoner of war labor. Approximately 1 million German prisoners were held in the Soviet Union and used for reconstruction work, and the fierce determination of a population that had survived the worst and was not prepared to live in ruins indefinitely. Stalingrad was rebuilt entirely by 1953. Kiev's center was rebuilt by 1950. The physical record of the war was erased. The craters filled, the rubble cleared, the streets repaved, with a speed that created the impression of recovery even before the underlying human and economic damage had been repaired. The veterans themselves occupied a complex and often painful position in Soviet society. The government had constructed an official narrative of the war, a narrative of heroic sacrifice and ultimate victory in which individual suffering, moral ambiguity, the catastrophic failures of 1941, the treatment of returning prisoners, the things done in German territory, none of these had a place. Veterans who tried to tell stories that complicated this narrative were discouraged, sometimes punished. Men who had experienced the most extreme events in modern history learned to be silent about them in public. Returning prisoners, Soviet soldiers liberated from German camps, faced a specific ordeal. Stalin's Order 270 of August 1941 had declared that Soviet soldiers who allowed themselves to be captured were traitors. Returning POWs were subjected to filtration, extended NKVD interrogation designed to determine whether they had collaborated with the enemy. The assumption of guilt meant that the burden of proof was reversed. A man who had survived German captivity had to prove he had not helped the Germans, a negative that was often impossible to establish. Many were sent to Soviet labor camps after surviving German ones. Others were returned to the army under watch, their lives permanently marked by the suspicion that having been captured implied something criminal. The Soviet government did not simply ignore what the war had cost. It commemorated it, but in a specific, controlled way that served political purposes. Victory Day on May 9th became the central ritual of Soviet public life, the anniversary around which the state organized its claims to legitimacy. The veteran who had fought in the war was celebrated in public. The veteran who spoke honestly about the war in private was discouraged. The gap between the public commemoration and the private experience was enormous and was felt throughout Soviet society as a kind of unreality, a national holiday for a war that had not quite happened the way the holiday described. The eternal flame at the tomb of the unknown soldier in Moscow, which has burned continuously since it was lit in 1967 by Leonid Brezhnev, himself a veteran, marks the specific moral center of this official commemoration. The unknown soldier is a real concept, a real body from the Battle of Moscow interred beneath the Kremlin wall. The eternal flame is real. The grief of the families who visit is real. What surrounds it, the official rhetoric, the political uses to which the commemoration has been put by every Soviet and Russian government since, is more complicated. The war and the memory of the war have served so many political purposes, been invoked so many times to justify so many different policies, that it has become difficult in some contexts to separate the genuine grief from the instrumentalized grief. But the genuine grief is there. It is the grief of a country that lost 1 in 7 of its people, that carries the demographic shadow of that loss into the present day, that has in its collective memory the specific texture of what happened, the winters, the hunger, the specific smell of the ruins, the sound of the guns. That grief does not belong to any political system. It belongs to the people who lived it and to the descendants of those who did not survive. Grossman's fate in the post-war years is its own story. He returned from Berlin and spent the following years working on Life and Fate, the novel that would incorporate everything he had witnessed: Stalingrad, the Treblinka, the purges, the specific moral nature of the Soviet state as it had revealed itself under the pressure of total war. In February 1961, KGB officers arrived at his apartment and seized the manuscript. They took the typed pages, the carbon copies, the typed copies his friends had made, even the typewriter ribbons. A senior official told him the novel could not be published for 200 years, as if it were a dangerous radioactive material that needed geological time to become safe. Grossman wrote to Khrushchev personally, requesting the manuscript back. Mikhail Suslov, who had actually read it, replied that it could never be published in the Soviet Union. Grossman died in September 1964 of stomach cancer, believing his life's work was gone. It was not gone. His friend, the poet Semyon Lipkin, had made a copy of the manuscript before the KGB arrived, and had hidden it for years in a location he never revealed. In 1974, a copy was microfilmed and smuggled to the West. In 1980, 16 years after Grossman's death, 35 years after the war he had witnessed, Life and Fate was published by a Swiss publisher. It was translated into English in 1985 by Robert Chandler. It is now recognized as one of the masterworks of 20th century literature. A novel about Stalingrad that is also a novel about totalitarianism, about the individual human life against the systems that seek to erase it, about what it means to be alive in a century that had decided that individual lives were expendable. The physical landscape of the Soviet Union took decades to rebuild. Stalingrad was entirely reconstructed, a new city, built on the ruins of the old, renamed Volgograd in 1961. Leningrad was restored block by block, the historical facades rebuilt where records survived. Kyiv, Minsk, Smolensk, Kharkov, all rebuilt, all transformed in the process, all carrying within their reconstructed facades the specific knowledge of what had been there before and what it had cost to make it present again. The famine of 1946 and 1947, which killed approximately 1 million people largely in Ukraine and Moldova, was not acknowledged by the Soviet government. Veterans who had survived 4 years of the most extreme warfare in history died of hunger 2 years after the war ended. The government denied the famine's existence while it was happening and denied it for decades afterward. And the children who were not born, the demographic hole in the Soviet population created by the death of a generation of men, were visible in every census until the 1980s. Their absence was felt in the schools that didn't fill, the factories that struggled to find workers, the fields that were farmed by old women and children. The war's consequences rippled forward through time in ways that are still, 3 generations later, part of the social fabric of the countries that emerged from the Soviet Union's dissolution. What was built in the place of all that loss was a Soviet state that used the memory of the war simultaneously as a genuine locus of national feeling. Because the feeling was genuine, the sacrifice had been real, the grief was real, and as a political instrument. The Great Patriotic War became the foundational myth of the Soviet state, the thing that justified everything that had come before and everything that came after, the proof that the system had been worth the suffering it imposed. This was manipulative. It was also, in a specific and limited sense, true. The Soviet state, whatever its crimes, had defeated Nazi Germany. The price it paid for that victory was paid by 27 million people who had no choice in the matter. The veterans' practical situation in the post-war Soviet Union was one of the more painful ironies of the war's legacy. Men who had fought for 4 years, who had lost limbs and health and years and comrades, returned to a country that was itself desperately poor and that had very little to give them. Military pensions were inadequate. Housing was scarce. Millions of people were living in ruins or in barracks. Medical care for the wounded was inconsistent. Soldiers who had received basic treatment at frontline hospitals and been returned to duty had injuries that would cause them pain for the rest of their lives, and that the peacetime medical system was not equipped to address properly. The men who had lost all 4 limbs, the soldiers who could neither work nor care for themselves, were institutionalized in the late 1940s and early 1950s, removed from the public eye in a process that survivors and their families described as being made invisible. The Soviet state wanted a narrative of triumph, not one of broken bodies. The women who had served in the war, the nurses, the pilots of the Night Witches Regiment, the snipers and medics and signals operators and anti-aircraft gunners, faced a specific set of social pressures when they returned. Soviet society expected them to revert to their pre-war roles as wives and mothers, and many did, willingly or otherwise. But some struggled with the reintegration in ways that were not talked about publicly. Women who had been in the front lines, who had experienced the specific intensity of combat, found that peacetime life felt flat and strange in ways they could not easily explain to people who had not been there. The Soviet psychological understanding of what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder was minimal. People who struggled were told they were weak or counter-revolutionary, or simply wrong to struggle. The children who grew up in the shadow of the war, the generation born in the late 1940s and 1950s to parents who had survived it, absorbed the war through silence and through gaps. They grew up in houses where certain subjects were not discussed, where their fathers or uncles went quiet at certain kinds of questions, where the war was simultaneously the most important thing that had ever happened and the thing least likely to be explained. This silence shaped them in ways they only partially understood, and it shaped the Soviet culture of memory around the war in ways that lasted until the Soviet Union itself ended. Yakov Shapiro retired from teaching in 1972 and lived in his rebuilt village until 1988, the year before the events that would lead to the Soviet Union's dissolution. His granddaughter, who became a historian, wrote a brief account of him in a Ukrainian regional history published in 2003. She said he had spoken about the war only once more in his life, near the end, when she had asked what he remembered most clearly. He was quiet for a long time. "The horse," he said finally. "The horse I hid under on the first night." His name was Bulin. The soldier who owned him had painted his name on a piece of wood and tied it to the harness. Bulin. I don't know why I remember that. I don't remember most things. He did not explain why he remembered it. She did not press him. The horse named Bulin. One specific horse on one specific night, at the beginning of the largest, most destructive, most consequential land war in human history. Memory works this way with catastrophe, not by preserving it whole, which would be more than the mind can contain, but by holding specific details that stand for the whole. The horse named Bulin stands for everything that happened to Shapiro in 4 years of war. Rubashkin's Turgenev burned for warmth stands for the siege. Dill's entry about food stands for the cauldron. Grossman's figure standing in the middle of a Berlin street stands for the liberation. These are the fragments that survived. They are fragments of lives that were themselves fragments of the war, which was itself a fragment, however vast, of the human story. The work of history is to hold these fragments in relationship to each other, to understand the connections between them, to see how the policy decisions made in offices in Berlin produced the conditions in which a Soviet private named Dobryakov ran toward the sound of the guns because his sergeant ran and he ran after him, and how that running eventually, at enormous cost and over 4 years, brought Soviet soldiers to the streets of Berlin. The connections are real. The cost was real. The people were real. This is what memory does with catastrophe. It does not preserve the statistics. It does not remember the armies and the corps and the divisions and the operational movements and the strategic turning points. It remembers the horse, the soldiers of the Eastern Front, 12 million of them, carrying their rifles through those 4 impossible years, left behind a world that would have been very different without them. The defeat of Nazi Germany required their sacrifice. The liberation of Europe from a racial ideology that had planned the elimination of entire peoples required that 12 million soldiers stand in the path of that ideology and refuse to yield. They refused, at a cost that their own government spent decades trying to minimize and that the West spent decades ignoring. They refused. Most of their names were never recorded. Most of their stories were never told. Most of them died in places where no correspondent was present, where no photograph was taken, where the only witnesses were other soldiers who also died. This has been an attempt to tell some part of what they lived through and died for. Not the whole story. The whole story is beyond the capacity of any single account, beyond the capacity of any single life to fully comprehend. It is too large, too long, too costly. But some of it. Vasily Zaitsev, patient in the rubble, watching a piece of metal. Yakov Pavlov, who held a building for 58 days. Ivan Kozhedub, who flew over the burning steppe and came home 64 times more than the Germans who tried to stop him. Zina Tusnolobova, who went out under fire to bring back a fallen soldier and lost her arms and legs in the snow and dictated letters to the front from her hospital bed. Mikhail Devyatev, who flew a stolen German bomber across the Baltic Sea in February 1945, starving, in an aircraft he had taught himself from observation through a fence. Vasily Grossman, who walked through all of it and wrote it down so that someday, in some form, we could know. There is a Russian word podvig that translates inadequately as feat or exploit, but that carries a connotation of something more specifically Soviet and more specifically moral. A deed done under the hardest possible circumstances, that demonstrates not just courage but the capacity of a human being to exceed what seems to be the limit of human endurance. The Soviet culture of the Great Patriotic War was saturated with the concept of podvig, the extraordinary act, the sacrifice beyond ordinary sacrifice. It was used, certainly, for propaganda purposes. It was applied to things that were officially convenient whether or not they deserved the term. But there were real podvigi, real acts of the kind the word was coined for. Nurse Zina going out under fire. Devyatev learning a cockpit through a fence. The night witches flying their slow biplanes in silence over German positions for the 1000th time. The workers in the Stalingrad factories standing in November snow to protect machinery that would produce the tanks that might bring their husbands home. The 625 women engineers who designed and then maintained the road of life across frozen Ladoga. The political officer who came each night to Pavlov's house with whatever supplies could be carried through the trench, making sure the garrison knew they had not been forgotten. The soldiers at Stalingrad who went out each night to bring in the wounded, under fire, from no man's land that was a smoking field of rubble and broken concrete. These acts were performed by people who were also frightened, also cold, also hungry, also aware that what they were doing might kill them. The specific human texture of the Eastern Front, which is the most important thing to understand about it, is not the abstraction of sacrifice but the concreteness of specific people making specific decisions in specific conditions to do specific difficult things because the alternative was something worse. And the ones whose names are gone. The border guard who hid under a horse named Bulin. The schoolteacher in Leningrad who burned his books one by one and watched a boy's mother arrive at the door with an empty school bag. The woman who fell in the December street in the siege's first winter. The soldiers who stood upright in Stalingrad in February 1943, blinking in the pale light of a winter morning, looking at the ruins of the place where they had refused to die. They were there. And because they were there, and because they stayed when staying seemed impossible, and because they fought when fighting seemed hopeless, and because they built and produced and transported and nursed and flew and held buildings and dug trenches and crossed rivers at night under fire, because of all of that, the world in which you are watching this video exists in the form it takes rather than another form it might have taken. That is not a small thing. If their story kept you awake tonight, there are others like it. Other soldiers history chose to forget, other corners of the largest war in human history that deserve the same attention, the same weight, the same care. Subscribe, and we'll make sure some of them are never forgotten. Jason. Slug. The Eastern Front 12 million. Title_recommended. The Eastern Front, 12 million soldiers, and the war that decided everything. Number_slides. 72. Style_suffix. WW2. Voice_name. NUS Brian Ural. Voice_rate. +0%. Cite_mode. Marked. Thumbnail_source_slide. 4. Thumb_source_slide. 4. Thumb_title. Eastern Front. Thumb_subtitle. The War That Decided Everything. Tags. Eastern Front WW2. World War II. Operation Barbarossa. Stalingrad. Soviet Union WW2. Red Army. Kursk. WW2 History. Forgotten War. World War II Eastern Front. Operation Bagration. WW2 Documentary.